James Lindsay, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So you are a name that has come up in our comments section quite a bit as a request from viewers/listeners, especially on YouTube. So I'm excited to have you here. Our mutual friend, Peter Boghossian, has been on the show a couple times. And so we're rounding out the Grievance Studies. We've just got Helen Pluckrose, and then we can have the trifecta of the Grievance Studies crew. I thought I'd kick us off with something that that should make you proud and that I'm somewhat jealous of. And that is that the Southern Poverty Law Center has an entire page on you. And well, for those who aren't familiar with this organization, it's basically a sort of radically left hit piece operation that has managed kind of amazingly to convince people who maybe are actually just toady allies that it's somehow like a neutral arbiter of goodness and light. And so it writes, James Lindsay has quickly become a leading voice, you should be proud of that, in the reactionary anti-student inclusion, anti-LGBTQ, and conspiracy propaganda movements. Lindsay regularly shares conspiracy theories about the supposed communist takeover of the world, especially the United States, promotes groomer rhetoric against LGBTQ community, and spreads the white genocide theory that Marxists want to eradicate the white race. With alarmism and fear-mongering, James Lindsay incites and segregates his base. And it goes on to often quote you in ways that are like, do you realize what you're quoting here? Like it quotes a long tirade in which you decry, essentially Andrew Tate style fake hypermasculinity and call for a more well-rounded and positive vision for young men. And it quotes that like you're a Nazi. So
yeah, it's really funny actually. If you actually have it up there, I don't know if you have like notes or if you actually have the website up. If you have the website up, you should look at the top and see how they categorized me, because they have categories of what type of bad person you are.
Yeah, I see. And so there's the hyperlink to anti-LGBTQ, and then conspiracy propagandists are the two related. Maybe there's some additional.
No, there's a category. I don't have it in front of me. There's a categorization at the top. I'll just tell you what I'm thinking of. One of the categories is that they put me under anti-government general, which, so I'm generally, I guess, anti-government now. So I took that as a title and I was like, so I'm the anti-government general. Cool. And then they also categorized me under general hate, which I also took as a title. And I did a podcast thanking them for calling me general hate and made a bunch of graphics. I think I sell t-shirts about me being general hate where I photoshopped my face onto an old, Revolutionary War painting or something. And, yeah, so they're crazy. I mean, if you actually look through it, you'll find that there's this opening section. What they accused me of there is like 4 things, I think, and 3 of them are kind of true in the twisted left-wing way. And then I don't actually promote the white genocide theory. Like that's literally made up off of one interpretation of one tweet that I made that was taken out of context years ago. And so they try to make as much hay out of like nothing as they possibly could. But then if you scroll down just a little bit, the first thing they talk about in any substantial way about me is that I made a series of tweets mocking George Floyd on January 6th. Like, it's the stupidest thing in the world. I pretended that George Floyd was like, basically Democrat Santa Claus. And if you fight for George Floyd's justice, then Jay Sixsmith, his ghost will bring you presents. And I just made these stupid tweets just being like flippant, like January 6th, I don't know, 2022 or 3, whatever year, it doesn't matter. I thought it was just funny on the day, just something silly and fun. And it's the first thing they use to like show what a bad person I am, is that I made these stupid jokes about George Floyd on January 6th that are absolutely idiotic. Just to kind of show you how stupid they are. But it turns out, like you said, they've convinced normies or whatever that this is somehow some important organization that has important things to say. So as it turns out, that crap has consequences. Here's 2. I was just in New Zealand, right? And I was invited there to speak by the deputy prime minister, which seems like kind of a cool thing. So I
Yeah.
spoke for David Seymour at his party meeting, or the rally that they had after their annual general meeting for their party. And it went very well. Everything was very, nice. It was a good little, 2-hour event. It wasn't a big deal. And there was a pretty decent, protest, mostly online. There's a dozen or so people that showed up outside. Most of them were like Antifa, actually, but it was pretty stupid. But they posted up online pretty hard. And the main point to try to rally Kiwis against me was that I have this Southern Poverty Law Center profile that says all these terrible things about me. And that's what they used as evidence that I'm some huge problem and shouldn't be welcomed to the country of New Zealand. And I got a bunch of nasty notes from a bunch of left-wing activists when I was there and after I got home saying, you're not welcome in our country, get out, you fascist, you terrible person. But it's all predicated off of the fact that this Southern Poverty Law Center thing looks official. Secondly, and this is that's of no real consequence, but I can't even go to literally the other side of the world and get away from the stupid Southern Poverty Law Center. But more consequentially, I was at one point in the past, and just to remain as vague as possible intentionally to protect all parties involved, I won't give any specifics as to what it was about, but I was invited tentatively to possibly testify in the U.S. Senate and on a particular topic of some importance within my range of expertise. So I submitted a kind of, written draft of what my testimony might look like to the senator who was inviting me. He liked it. So that narrows it down. It's one of the male senators that invited me. You can nail him now. So he liked it. And, I was on the let's see if we can fit you in the schedule list, which is like the second, who would we kind of like? Okay, can we make the schedule work? And then they come back to me and they say, no hard feelings. We can't have you, and I thought, well, there's other people. It's kind of my thing was sort of tangential to the main thing. So I would kind of expected that and wasn't that put off by it. But I was like, yeah, no big deal. And he was like, it's not that your testimony is not valuable. Actually, it would be really great if we could. This was one of his staffers saying this. It's that that Southern Poverty Law Center profile you have is obviously ridiculous, but you're going to sit there and what's going to happen is you'll give your testimony and every Democrat in the room is going to ask you about it. And it's just a distraction from what we're trying to achieve to have that. So what the Southern Poverty Law Center is doing has a purpose. Right? Yeah. It's not just to create this sense of gravity, but that sense of gravity gives, say, in that case, elected Democrats in the upper chamber of Congress the ability to derail testimony based off of this completely made up nonsense thing that the Southern Poverty Law Center wrote, from what appears to be the depths of a fever dream.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.
There is what Mike Benz and Michael Schellenberger and others have called a censorship industrial complex that is very interconnected, and it's very clear to me that the Southern Poverty Law Center is part of that. It's part of a sort of as a longtime computer nerd, there was this term FUD back in the day, which was that when a new product would be announced, Microsoft in particular was good at spreading FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's what this is. This is let's just chink your ethos and get you a little on people that don't know you and don't know the Southern Poverty Law Center and are just regular people. They're still like, oh, I don't know about this. Oh, yeah. If it's Southern poverty, they must have been fighting for civil rights in the 60s, so they must be good guys.
Yeah.
So therefore, he must hate black people or something. Okay, I don't know if he's suspect now.
Yeah, and this complex is actually, this is fairly well recognized at this point. It's not like groundbreaking material, but like that stuff becomes credentialing information that can leak onto your Wikipedia page or end up getting, I shouldn't say leak, it gets aggregated onto your Wikipedia page. Same as, you'll get certain articles written about you if you've upset the apple cart enough, and say Vox or Salon or Slate or one of these kind of hit piece rags will write a thing about you. And then that will be become the citation written into your Wikipedia. And I have some fairly solid back channel information that is actually partially, not entirely. Wikipedia editors are not all, some nefarious cult, but there are embedded, deliberate actors who are putting that stuff into your Wikipedia profile such that, somebody comes across my work. They're like, who's this James Lindsay guy? They go look at my Wikipedia and it says all this crazy stuff about me. And unless you kind of have the magic decoder goggles of the censorship industrial complex mentality, then you read it, you're just like, oh, he's probably nuts, And when I say that this is a censorship industrial complex, obviously reflects off of the concept of military industrial complex. And the military industrial complex, the military is literally a government agency, right?
Yeah.
And so the point here, and this is of course why people like Mike Benz would be so interested in it, is that there are very strong reasons to believe that government actors are part of that network. In fact, possibly the ones that are sometimes editing the Wikipedia page. And then once it gets on your Wikipedia page, again, you face this same problem. You've got your good senator probably doing some deep diving research to find out who's this guy who might be testifying, and he looks that up, or she looks that up, and it's like, oh my gosh, look at this. He said this terrible, crazy thing that's obviously taken way out of context. And then what's the citation? Oh my gosh, the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is serious. And then, like you said, you get the FUD effect, and then beyond the FUD effect, if you get called to do anything official or important, you get grilled on it. It becomes a point that anything, if I get called as an expert witness in a court case, which sometimes happens, chances are very good on deposition that I'm going to have to defend myself against the Southern Poverty Law Center accusations. It's like it becomes this albatross that's like a fake albatross. It's like a heavy stuffed albatross that they've chained to your neck, and you can't get rid of it because, oh my gosh, it's a Southern Poverty Law Center. So yeah, I mean, this is a real phenomenon in terms of how they, create a kind of soft silencing of people who they don't want having their voice elevated.
It's so I want to dive into the substance of so much of your work, but before I do, I think this is an important subject for people because we live in a time where if you're remotely interested in big issues, whether it's the news or what's being talked about in your kid's social studies class, you go to the internet and you try to figure out what is true, and it's never been harder to do that. And so these are institutions that, I recently read this term. I know it's like a long-standing term, but they're in theory sense-making institutions. Help me make sense of what's true and false. Since you swim in these waters, you're very online. What advice do you have for people to make sense of the information they come across when you go to a website like Wikipedia, let's say, and it doesn't feel right, but you're in a hurry. You're not going to do a deep dive on something necessarily. You're trying to just get a handle on it. How do you check your sources?
Okay, so the question that you've asked could take the rest of the time to talk about, and we don't want to do that. So I'm got to gauge the depth with which I answer this question. As you might imagine, I reflect on this issue a lot. So the short answer is that what I have determined is the case. And I think there are, or at some point in the past at least, there were data bearing this out. And it's likely that data would bear this out. So I don't think I'm just speculating or that I live in a particularly nasty corner of a swamp or something, digitally speaking. I think it's the case that honestly, the first heuristic for being informed is, no joke, less is more. The less you look, the more likely you are to be informed. There's obviously a paradox there that if you look zero, you cannot possibly be informed. But if you look more than 0, it's almost a hard rule that the less you look, the better off you are. The sense-making industry, if we dare call it that, is mostly full of propaganda and BS. It is largely occupied by what I have come to refer to as the churn, as in like churning butter or a churning sea that will grind you against the rocks and destroy you. Even when it's not propaganda, it's very often the sense-making is done primarily by pundits, influencers, and grifters who need content today. So they are semi-know-nothings who have put virtually no research into whatever it is that they're talking about. They have some background because they've worked in politics or they've been around the people or whatever, and they follow the news. The news says some things, they give 5 seconds of thought to it and 40 seconds of commentary, and they go to the next piece that the producers threw in front of their faces. There's almost no depth. There's almost no reading. There's almost no actual understanding. There's no time for that. You have 2 to 3 hours a day to fill of churn. So a lot of the popular sense-making apparatuses that are available to us are churn. Others, like I said, are dedicated propagandists, especially on social media. It's possibly as high as 50% of what you see on social media is disingenuous and likely with a hostile intent to misinform. I don't want to give credit to the so-called, disinformation, misinformation complex that the Democrats were appealing to. The thing is that it's real. It's just that their censorship solution didn't make it better. They actually made it worse.
And they were running it. They were running it hard.
Yeah,
it was like,
that's right.
We're going to be the disinformation board, or I should say, no, that was right.
Yeah.
No, that's what we are. That's what we are. We are the disinformation board.
So one of the things, obviously, is how do I actually make sense of the world? And I have actually a sidebar about Wikipedia, if I remember to, about this. But I gather most of my information generally from osmosis. I categorize everything as I first encounter it as this is what people are talking about. That doesn't mean anybody who's talking about it is right. It just means this is what's being talked about. And so people are talking about this thing. The first thing that you want to do if you want to get better information is head toward primary sources. If it's news, there probably aren't very many primary sources, so I apply a 48 or 72-hour rule. I also apply what I might call a 3 feet of influence rule. Does this matter to me? Is this relevant, right? So I'll give you an example that was really shocking for me a few weeks ago. I don't know how long ago, it's a month or so ago, but there was this story that blew up in the news where some crazy guy becomes, for whatever reason, in Idaho, North Idaho, Coeur d'Alene area, becomes disgruntled with the fire department. So he goes up into the mountains and he sets a brush fire, and the firefighters come up to fight the brush fire, and he picks them off like snipers. Okay, so this blows up all over social media. Oh my God, it's a terrorist attack. What's going on? Everybody's speculating. The churn is frothing. The BS is flowing. People are sure it's a jihadist. People are sure it's this. People are sure it's that. Oh my God. Everybody's giving their take on this. And I sat there and watched this, and I looked at my wife across the room, and I said, why the F do I need to know this is happening? This is in North Idaho. I don't give a S what's happening. Why do I need to know this? I have problems, and I wasn't having a bad day. I live in Tennessee. There's Tennessee stuff happening around me. I've got to figure out how I'm going to organize my day. I don't know what's going on there, but I don't need to know about this. So within a few hours, we find out that it's actually a crazy guy or whatever, and it's not some terrorist event or whatever. And then I'm like, I didn't need to know this. I absolutely did not need to know that that happened. It was of no relevance to me in any way. So I have this kind of 3 feet of influence rule that I apply now. Am I getting sucked into some argument in some other part of the world that either I can't affect at all, so it's outside of my 3 feet of influence, 3 feet being about how long your arm is, by the way, from midline to your fingertips is about 3 feet. Can I reach it? No, I don't need to know about it. So I can file that into, I don't know, it's ambiguous. I have no need to even give a take on it, which is take culture, just strangle it and drown it in a bathtub. We don't need to give our takes on effing everything. It drives me up a wall. Yeah. But it's like, can I affect that? No. Is it anywhere near me? No. Is it likely to affect my life other than a disturbance on social media? No. Okay. I don't need to know the truth about that. So all of a sudden, I free up a lot of mental space with the 3 feet of influence rule. But the other thing is, like, who's talking about it? Are we talking about an actual primary source, or are we listening to a news pundit? Are we listening to a influencer? Are we listening to, who are we listening to? Why are we listening to it? Why are we reading the random takes of some other dude sitting in his living room, probably in his underwear, that isn't anywhere near Idaho, about what's happening in Idaho? We have absolutely no reason to do that. So, I have to apply all these filters that basically boils down to everything I'm reading is bull crap and I don't need to ingest it anyway. Now, what about, like, if I need to really find something out? Okay, so somebody tells me something about the Nazis. This is a big hot topic these days. So, okay, let's reflect that off of primary sources. This is hard work. If you want to find out the truth, you don't believe what the guy on the podcast says, you go read the source. You read Mein Kampf, you read some of the letters, you read some of the speeches, you go and get the direct information. P.S. That's hard work. That's a master's degree at the end of the road. So that's hard work, right? But if you actually want to find out what the truth is, that's what you have to do. And if you don't want to find out what the truth is, that's totally cool. You have other things to do. My wife's a gardener. She cares a lot about plants. She does not care about Nazis. She does not want to know what was going on and is not particularly interested, but she also doesn't go run her mouth about them, right? And so you don't have to talk about things that you don't actually know about is kind of one of the helpful filters here. And then what about Wikipedia? Here's actually Wikipedia. Wikipedia gets some really short shrift, but also most of the opprobrium it receives is totally deserved. And as with Wikipedia, so with basically the whole internet, including the commentary sphere. If you go look up something that has no political relevance, let's say some chemical compound that you've stumbled across and you're reading, and you're like, what's that? You're like, acetaldehyde, what's acetaldehyde? And you go look up acetaldehyde and you read about acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde, by the way, is the primary metabolite of alcohol, and it's the thing that gives you a hangover, if you wonder which compound that is. It's interesting. You might have stumbled across this. You might want to know more about it. You go to Wikipedia. 99% chance that if it's some non-political, which can include historical or person, non-political object, you're getting great information on Wikipedia. High chance. The encyclopedic quality of Wikipedia for technical, non-political things is reasonably good for what it is, and in some cases extraordinary, in fact beyond the capacity. As a former mathematician and physicist, I've looked up a lot about various mathematical and physics things on Wikipedia, things that I'm actually knowledgeable enough about but maybe want to brush up on. And these technical articles are usually, not always, but they're usually pretty good, if not great.
They're being constructed by fellow nerd physicists and mathematicians who just
which was
love
the
it.
original idea.
Yeah,
if
it's
it
the
was
long
never,
tail. It's the long tail of information.
That's right. Now, on the other hand, if you're looking up either of a historical event or a person of intrigue, a political entity, historically, or so it could be a movement, it could be an event that occurred historically, the Battle of the Bulge or whatever it happens to be. If you look any of that up, you got to be a little bit more careful. Probably what you're reading is you're going to have like your censorship industrial complex decoder ring as you read it. And some of it you have to be extremely careful. There are dedicated projects that sometimes get caught and fixed and sometimes don't to edit Wikipedia for hostile political interests in large-scale operations, as in, let's take everything that we can relevant to the history of, say, World War I and skew it so that it has a slightly anti-Semitic slant to it. Those projects exist. Almost nobody knows those projects exist. They are happening. They are led by hostile forces in the world. And therefore, the conclusion is, if it's a politically charged subject, Wikipedia becomes, or a first internet search becomes, your starting place. But the only way you can get verifiable and good information is to talk to an actual expert, which has its own dangers because sometimes credentialing is BS. But then investigating the primary sources yourself and doing so in a way that is not curated to produce a particular outcome. So you have to be very careful if you rely on, say, your favorite internet historian, that he may be curating what he's finding to tell a story. That's called historicism as opposed to history. The short version of the answer is it's very hard. The less you interact with information, the more likely you are to be accurately informed, because you're so likely to encounter deliberately misinforming garbage that it's better that it's not actually entering your head too much. But if you want to be actually informed, if you're not actually reading hard primary sources as the backdrop against which you can compare what you're seeing, you're lost.
One of the things that you have been doing for years now is compiling and trying to decode the genetic material, the language of the wokeism, this sort of identity politics, progressive. There's a whole bunch of buzzwords we can use: woke, postmodern, neo-Marxist, communist. All kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of stuff. And I think for the person that, I think maybe, I don't know what percentage of people get off-put by these kind of terms, but it's non-trivial. You call something sort of communistic, and there's going to be a fair amount of people that are immediately like, you sound extreme. What are you talking about? We don't have communism. That guy just wants rent control.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of individuals pursuing their particular interests or whatever.
And I think there's a reasonable concern to say, hey, not everything's literally communism. And I'm saying this mostly for myself because I'm inclined to see communism everywhere. But what prompted this effort, this new discourses.com and the level of specificity that you've taken? Because you have gone to primary sources. You've gone down the rabbit hole into Foucault and straight back to Marx. And I want to dive into it specifically, but just very briefly, kind of what motivated building such a kind of alt Wikipedia of the woke?
Yeah, I mean, back when people were still happy with me, kind of broadly speaking, I was described as frequently described. I didn't give this appellation to myself, but I was frequently described as the Rosetta Stone for woke. So I kind of was, writing the thing that would translate how they think and view the world back into normal, comprehensible English. And I was very proud of that. That's kind of what I've aspired to be, actually. I said that when I first started kind of going in the direction that became New Discourses, I'll tell the story just momentarily, but when I first started going that direction, I said that I basically wanted to be like the Skunk Works or DARPA for the culture war. I wanted to build all the cool James Bond style gadgets for how we would be able to fight this war. Let other people, in the field figure out what to do with them. I think that in retrospect, that might have been a slight miscalculation on my part, but that's what I endeavored to do, and I think that's what I actually largely achieved. So I'm pretty happy and proud of that work. I will also say just briefly about, you don't want to call everybody a communist. Everything you said is true. You lose people the second you use words like communist or fascist or whatever because, that's way too far, and they can't be like that. I don't want to sound trite or silly, but communism is a spectrum. The whole goal is literally the mystification of people. It is to get them pulled into supporting lines that support the communist's ambition. So you can have somebody who is not a communist, in fact, who identifies as being anti-communist, who has been pulled into supporting a line, which might be called a mass line in certain circumstances, or an active measure, that enables the communist who is pulling the strings or pushing the propaganda or running an operation to be able to try to get a political end achieved to increase their own power. This is very frequently done. This is a classic political technique of creating a literally bogus protest in the street. You pay a bunch of people to show up and protest. You hope some people organically join, but you create a protest around an issue, knowing that you have, say, 2 people in the city council or whatever that are sympathetic to some policy change. So you get the people protesting to demand the policy change or demand conditions that would be solved by the policy change. And then the politicians spring up and say, I have an idea. We could solve this problem, which is an obvious problem because there's a protest, even though the protest was fake. It was literally a manufactured object or astroturf. We have the solution in this policy proposal. So you need maybe 1 or 2 communists, actual communists who are in place, maybe a few that are embedded into the crowd. So we're up to no more than 5 to 6 total communists in the whole program. And then enough money to pay people to show up and yell about something who don't really know what's going on. And then you can pull this whole operation. So communism's on a spectrum. You can be a little bit communist, you can be a sympathizer, you can actually just be a useful idiot, as the terminology goes. But okay, that is relevant because if you don't understand the terminology, that this is what I've dedicated myself to, this is why in kind of the big, noble, principled picture, why I decided to do what I've done, is my belief has been that if people can see these kinds of tricks, linguistic tricks, political stunts, and so on more clearly for what they are, they're less likely to fall for them. It's as simple as if you know how imagine that you have a stage magician and you're watching a magic trick, right? If you know how he does his trick, it's not magic anymore. It's possibly immense skill and you're impressed that he could pull it off that smoothly, but the magic is literally gone because the magic is located in having a setup A that leads to an outcome B with no explanation for how A got to B. The magic is in the lack of explanation from A to B there, right? But when you know the trick, you know what, even if you can't do it, you can't reproduce it, you know how you got from A to B, and the magic literally evaporates. Now, if we swap out the stage magician, who's an entertainer, who we've all paid to entertain us by intentionally fooling us, but that's part of the bargain. That's why we bought the ticket, was we want to be fooled because we want to be mystified by his magic tricks. If we swap him out with a hustler who does, or a con man who does the same kind of trick, but in order to say, rob us, I used to give the example of a shisty, kind of magician who meets you in the hallway and says, you want to see a card trick, blah, blah, blah. What's your card? And you pull it out and whatever. And then he's like, open your wallet, at the end of the trick, and there's your card, but none of your money is in your wallet because somehow he stole all your money.
He's running to be mayor of New York.
Yeah, exactly. Or, your watch is gone or whatever else. You want to know how those tricks are done. And if you know how those tricks are done, you're less likely to fall for them. You're more able to kind of prepare yourself for them. So that's kind of big picture principle why I did what I have been doing, which required me to dive deep. The kind of more, friendly story, the actual nuts and bolts of, how did you go from being a, mathematician? I'm not going to go all the way back to 2010 and deciding I didn't want to be in the university anymore. But how did you end up where you are from your training, which doesn't match? That story, basically, there were reasons we did the Grievance Studies affair. I'm sure Peter and maybe Helen have talked about those. I won't rehash them here.
Yeah,
but we were going to show the problem.
We had a shoot together with my team that we'll put up separately, that where you went into more detail about that. So
sure. So yeah, I'm not going to rehash it again. Go look up the Grievance Studies affair. We were going to show that there was BS going on in academia. Well, the turning point of this story comes, we write this paper about education. It was Peter's idea. We got it straight out of the news. A professor in Pennsylvania got in trouble for doing what was called a progressive stack in the classroom. And progressive stack means you assess how privileged everybody is or oppressed they are by some mechanism. The privilege walk is a very common mechanism where everybody has to take steps forward if they have, this privilege, and if they don't, they can stay. If they stay still, or if they're oppressed, they take steps backwards. Then you just put everybody in a line according to how far forward and backwards they are, and you know how privileged everybody is. And what the stack is that the more privilege somebody has, the less opportunities they get in class, and the more oppressed they are, basically, the more legs up you give them, extra credit or whatever else, extra help, something, right? So we wrote this rather ridiculous paper basically claiming that on the privileged end, we needed to frame as educational opportunities what boils down to abusing the students out of their privilege. The goal being to make them experience reparations is what we literally said. And this included like chains and sitting in the floor and getting talked over, never being answered, having your emails never answered if you had a question, all these different things. Being insulted by the teacher through the classroom publicly in front of everybody, having to confess to your privilege in front of people, all the stuff. And so we said that we thought it'd be funny because we were writing these hoax papers and we wanted them all to have an element of humor to them. So the funny thing was, we also didn't think it would get published just to say that like we're going to abuse people as an educational opportunity. So we said that we'll do it with compassion. And we gave this whole section about something called critically compassionate intellectualism, which I don't even know what that is anymore, but some stupid fluff section to back this up. And the peer reviewers write us back and they say, you can't use, we love the idea, but you can't use compassion because it threatens to recenter the needs of the privileged. And it's like, oh no. And I thought about this for a while.
Wait,
okay,
hold on. I want to make sure I understand. So you submit a paper to one of these.
To Hypatia, the leading feminist philosophy journal.
Okay.
Yes.
So to the leading feminist philosophy journal, this is one of the components in this architecture of peer review that academia is fundamentally, as I understand it, rooted in being liked. But it's called peer review. So you literally are running a popularity contest with your peers to see if they like you. And that's the currency of academia. You submit this paper saying we want to functionally abuse students on the basis of whether they, for example, have a 2-parent household and were read books as a kid. And versus
and are white.
Yeah, and are white and all the usual male. And heterosexual male and all the whole woke hierarchy thing. And they didn't like your use of the word compassion because that compassion might be applied to the privileged kids. Am I hearing that right?
That's exactly right.
The abuse needs to be without compassion.
Correct.
Resubmit, but strip the compassion out.
Correct. And in fact, they said that they recommend this thing called the pedagogy of discomfort. Pedagogy is a theory of education. And it's written by this woman, Megan Bowler. That's Boler. If anybody wants to look her up, the book is called Feeling Power. It was written in the late 90s, and Megan Bowler has this chapter on something she calls the pedagogy of discomfort. And so the idea is actually that to overcome privilege as an educational opportunity, that you lead the learner into profound emotional discomfort and you leave them to sit with it. You don't help them resolve it. So compassion's out. That's what they said. And so I sat there and thought about this for a couple weeks, kind of stunned. I mean, practically speaking, we just got to work on changing the paper, but this was eating at me, right? And I get on the phone with the guy that's doing the documentary film for the project, Mike Nana, who was there at Freedom Fest with us, and who he's an Australian guy, and the film is called The Reformers, and it documents kind of what we did, and a lot about the Brett Weinstein Evergreen story as well for people who are interested in that. It's on his Substack, Michael Nana Substack. So we have a conversation Mike and I do on the phone one night. He's in Australia. I'm here. It's night here. I don't know what time. It's probably morning for him. And we conclude that logic ends in genocide if taken to its logical conclusion. So we decided that the phrasing that I was going to use was that it is the seed of a genocide, not the tree, not the fruit, not the actual thing, just the seed from which one could grow. Of course, you saw my Southern Poverty Law Center profile, so you know how that got spun. And so anyway, I was so alarmed by this. This was the turning point. I went to my wife after a couple of weeks of stewing on this, and I told her what it was, and she frankly didn't care that much. She thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. And
normal people hear these things and say, "What are you talking about? That sounds crazy. That sounds crazy."
Like, "I'm glad it's important to you, honey," or whatever. And so I went to her and said that I wanted to quit my job and dedicate all of my time. I said, I basically have a small amount of a head start looking into this, and I have a small amount of a head start in understanding it. And I'm going to have a platform as a result of this project. That's like you're kind of aware that it's going to get attention. So I have to use whether it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes on the stage to be able to push the message that what's happening in academia is not funny. It's really dangerous. And that's going to require me to learn as much about it as I can and so on. And she, very practical woman said, can you make money doing that? And that was actually literally the first thing she said back. Can you make money doing that? And I didn't know. And we worked out an agreement of how long I had to try. And so then that's part one of the story. That's my actual commitment to, oh my God, I need to dedicate my life to understanding and exposing this moment. And then come end of that was the beginning of 18, January. And by the end of 18, unknown to me, the guy that I founded New Discourses with, his name's Michael O'Fallon. He's fairly well known too at this point, and was very well known in certain Christian circles at the time back then. So he's in Ireland running a tour for the tour company that he actually is his real job. And they're going from place to place. And Michael has this habit of wanting to be as informed as possible. So typically while he's getting ready, anytime he's sitting around, he has a lecture or whatever playing in the background. So he's listening at that point to Jordan Peterson while he's taking his shower and shaving and getting ready in the morning before his day for whatever.
I was listening to your video about exclusion and private property on a little waterproof speaker that I use in the shower because I'm exactly the same. And I think it's actually like a problem.
It is. I mean, it is a problem with him. He does it literally all the time. I mean, it's commendable. You get in the car with him. He's got a lecture on.
Some of it's information addiction, I think, but
he's always trying to understand the things that he's looking at. And so his preferred way, he does read, of course, but he's very auditory and he's usually got his hands full. So he's usually listening to this lecture. So he's in the shower. And the reason that the shower is relevant is because he's not exactly touching his device and can't do anything about it. So he's listening to a Jordan Peterson lecture that he'd wanted to listen to again. It ended. And at the time, YouTube had already implemented its auto-populate or suggested next video thing with the little, 10-second countdown, and then the next video starts. So he's in the shower, can't push any buttons, gets in, Jordan Peterson ends, and this panel that I did with Peter and Helen, while we were doing the Grievance Studies affair, we went out to Portland and we did a panel at PSU. It is the night, while we were giving that panel, is when the dog park paper got accepted. That's an iconic scene in our released video that was shot that evening, as it turns out. So that video of us talking starts playing, and Michael's like, these guys are onto something. And the topic was, is intersectionality a religion? And he was like, these guys are onto something. And then I said in the video, somewhere he's listening to more of it, that the entire thing has an Augustinian construct behind it. Woke has an Augustinian construct. In other words, there's original sin. You have to do this kind of confessional repentance project in order to get, you can't ever quite get rid of your original sin and so on. And I say this just, saying that, trying to make the comparison to religion. And Michael had been trying to make that case for about a year or more to people. This is an Augustinian framework. Chance? He grew up Catholic, but is Protestant and has been Protestant for a very long time now. So he's like, oh my God, somebody else knows what I'm talking about. And so he starts telling everybody in his circles, end of 18, come January of 19, he figures out how to get a hold of Peter and I and starts reaching out to us. By February of 19, he has this, we all go out to Las Vegas together. We have a big meeting at a hotel just to sit down and talk and see if there's something there. And the idea was, Michael's idea was, you need an organization underneath you and behind you that takes the research that you're doing and puts it out in a systematic fashion with a particular look, a particular branding, iconic one-stop shop where people know, if I need to know what's going on, I need to go read this guy. And I was like, well, we have this magazine we publish in and this magazine. He's like, no, it can't be scattered to the winds. It has to be in one place. And so he had this idea that we form some kind of an organization. We literally spent from February of 19 till October of 19 debating what the form of this thing would be, who would be involved, what we would all be doing. And we finally settled by October that Peter's going to go off and do this, and Helen's going to go off and do that. And they had their own ideas. And Mike is going to go off and do his film stuff. And I'm going to do new discourses with Mike. And so we incorporate in February or in October of 19. We launch in February of 2020. Part of the vision that we had was that we would do lots of conferences, which was not so smart in February of 2020.
2020. Wow, right at the start of COVID.
Yeah, so no conferences for a year and a half. But as it turned out, that was this weird kind of providential luck, because I got to spend a year doing or year and a half doing primary research, almost uninterrupted, because I wasn't going to events all over the place. We weren't putting on conferences. I stayed home and I read and I wrote and I did podcasts like this by Zoom or whatever, as often as I could, and got a strong working knowledge of what I was dealing with. But so Michael spurred the idea to create an organized, systematic, single source platform. I was motivated to do it because I thought we were facing literally the unraveling of civilization from the woke ideology. And I figured that I must know as much about this as possible. And the way that I approached it was start with the stuff that I know now, the crazy white fragility, blah, blah, blah. See who they cite, see what lines of thought it's embedded in. Even if they don't cite Foucault, is Foucault's fingerprint on this? Okay, go read Foucault. Oh, well, where did he get his ideas? Oh, the existentialists. So we got to read Sartre. We got to read Nietzsche with Foucault. We got to go backwards and understand, where did they get their ideas? Where, how do these people think, and how is that set of ideas operated? So I started at the front and went at the present, and I just went backwards and backwards and backwards. And then periodically I would try to retell the story from however far back I had dug forward. And then I would go back further. And, we don't have to stop at Karl Marx. We can go before Marx. I spent a long time talking about Hegel before him, Rousseau before him as well.
Yeah. Rousseau's a big figure in articulating a lot of what I would almost say is he's maybe one of the early people that gives voice to intuitions that I think are fundamentally quite human about human nature or what it is and isn't. But he's a big figure, and I want to dive into the couple of the big figures that are underneath the surface of all of this. But so he's a big one.
That's what I did and how and why I did it. So, just kind of three answers. I know you said be brief, that didn't happen. But there were like the three things, like the big principle, and then like the turning point moment, and then the organizational structure moment, which is a part of the story that I almost never tell, by the way. Like the whole Michael thing is shrouded in mystery, and there's all these conspiracy theories about us. It's like, it's an interesting I kind of wish we had this James Bond life, but it's really like two dudes talking on the phone and trying to figure out like what information would be useful for people to learn about.
So there's we could probably dive into, we could easily spend hours and hours together on just one subset of the topics that you grapple with. But there are two spaces in particular I'd like to spend the rest of our time together on, and they're deeply connected, and they're massive. But one is, as best we can, the philosophy that is, I'm just going to call it modern communism, and we can and we can just start.
I call it 21st century communism, so that works perfectly.
It's just that's what this. And it has it's like this sticky core ball that rolls around and picks up all these other seemingly unrelated things. There's a poster that shows all these Venn diagrams with Gaza in the center as just one of many examples. But that's a current one of, you have to be pro-Palestinian because you're anti-colonialist, which is fundamentally a kind of anti-imperialist Marxism thing. There's all this stuff. And it all moves as one. It's all the same flags. In this house, we believe this laundry list of seemingly unrelated stuff. And I think there is a certain amount to which that's true on multiple sides.
You know what that flag is, by the way, when you have this laundry list of we believe all this seemingly unrelated stuff? Do you know what that's called?
No.
It's called a catechism.
Oh, sure. Right.
So
Well,
just back to the religious
Catholic,
architecture.
as a Catholic, I find all this really interesting. Increasingly, it's faux religion versus what I would say real religion, but
Yeah,
that's
of course.
So that's one piece. It's just like, let's take some time for the person that hears that and isn't already like, yeah, you're right, but is maybe like, oh, are you being extreme? And then the second piece, which to me is the most important, is how have the people, name the names, in this critical turn in education, which is something you've talked about a lot. Education is something I'm very, very passionate about. I talk about it all the time on this channel. And we just did a series about education, and we'll do many, many more. But I don't think people truly appreciate the nature of the toxins in the waters.
No, yeah, you're right. They have no idea.
And so let's start with what is this modern new communism, and where does it come from? In your view, like when we hear, whether it's the new prospective mayor of New York, who's simultaneously saying things that sound small, like I just want to make the buses free, but then he's also going on Zoom calls talking about seizing the means of production. That's like straight out of Lenin.
Yeah.
But then right alongside of that, you just dig a little deeper, and it's like, oh no, we've got to defund the police, and gender is a construct, and all this stuff around privilege. Why are all these things connected, and where do they start?
So the bad news is I actually did a workshop on this about a year ago in Dallas. And when I did that workshop, I spent about 8 hours developing the answer to this question. But I won't go on and on. I say that every time, but here we go. So the short answer to this, I also, by the way, just to point people to it, it's worth their time to go find it if they are interested. I gave a speech in March of 2023 at the European Parliament.
Yes.
It's the only time I've ever spoken at the European Parliament, so it's not hard to find. It is 28 minutes long. It went crazy viral. I think it's the best speech I ever gave. And I more or less answer this question there as well. So if you want to hear a succinct, proper treatment in front of a pretty big deal audience, there you go. But the long and short is that we think of Marxism kind of as this economic theory or this very discrete thing, and it's not. Marxism is a sprawling object that has at its core, I don't know if you know, the definition of truth and the solitary ethic of Marxism are the same thing. And a lot of people don't understand. This is the only ethic. You've noticed that maybe they're a little bit hypocritical sometimes, right? That they say one thing and they do something else. They say we're going to have inclusion and it seems very exclusive or whatever, right?
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways
is
to
defined by
that.
who's not allowed.
That's right. And so the ethic of Marxism, and I'm not exaggerating, I'm not making this up, this isn't my conclusion, this is actually the ethic of Marxism, is that which advances the opportunity for Marxists to take power, which is usually phrased, that which advances the revolution is ethical. Period.
The issue is never the issue.
That's right. As David Horowitz, from Radical Sun, related to us, after his time in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which is a communist organization, he comes out and says that one of the slogans that they used was the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. So the criterion for truth and the criterion for ethics in Marxism are both the same. That which advances the revolution is good and true. Nothing else is. Everything that hinders the revolution by converse is bad and evil. So that actually literally explains all their behavior down to last jot, if you think about it for a little while. But what happened is that Marxism was put forth by Karl Marx originally as this doctrine of basically the big mistake is people think he's giving an economic doctrine. What he actually was giving was an account of human nature. and a revolutionary program to advance human nature to its next stages that used economics as the explanation for why people are how they are. In other words, if you want to use kind of the funny language that people sometimes use, Marx assumed that man is homo economicus, that we are literally the products of our economic conditions. So when he says seize the means of production, just like Mendami says seize the means of production, what is he talking about? The production of what? Well, economic conditions. But economic conditions produce man. So it's a two-step process to seize the means of production of who man is. So the goal is to not make men into socialists, but to remind them that they're already socialists who forgot that because of private property. Private property gave them the ability to think this is mine, not yours, and that is yours, not mine. Therefore, we can withhold it from each other and we don't have to share, and we're not socialists, we're not communists anymore. We're individuals who get to have stuff. And Marx is like, no, we're actually socialists. Look how tribes organize themselves historically. We've got to figure out how to do that while retaining all the wealth of previous development, meaning everything, all the benefits of a capitalist and a feudal and so on society that we built up through history. That's the point. So as it turns out, in the opening part of the Communist Manifesto, Marx is very clear. He says that there is the entirety of history is the history of the conflict of classes. This is literally for chapter 1, how he starts the Communist Manifesto. There's a preface before that, but that's the first sentence of the real deal. The entire history of man is the history of class antagonisms. And so he then goes on and says, it can take this form. It can be, say, lord versus serf. It can be slaveholder versus slave. It can be plebeian versus patrician. It can be whatever. Bourgeois versus proletarian, whatever it is. He gives a bunch of examples. And I think that's extremely important because at different phases in history, the Marxists believe you have the same conflict of oppressor versus oppressed, because that's how Marx says it. Yeah. In a word, he says oppressor versus oppressed after he gives a bunch of examples. But it doesn't matter if it's bourgeoisie versus proletariat, because it could have been slaveholder versus slave, for example, or it could be white versus black, or it could be normal versus queer, or it could be male versus female. There's some line of stratification that causes an intrinsic conflict that defines not just society, but the movement of history, and the people participating in it are the actors who make and move history. In his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which he wrote in 1852, 4 years later, he says, of course, men make their own history, but they do not make it under conditions of their choosing. Our conditions are given to us. He famously says something like that the weight of all previous generations weighs on the imagination of men like a nightmare, or something like that. So we're trapped by our own oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. Now, remember, the ethic of Marxism is to seize the means of production of man. So once you decide what it is that must be producing man in a given society, so men are the product in industrial society of their economic conditions, then you know that you have to seize the means of economic production. But when you have an advanced capitalist society in the United States, let's say, that has figured out, basic worker protections, the labor movement has occurred and been incorporated into the capitalist structure. You've broken the idea of monopoly trust so that you don't have the agglomeration of capital that kind of would have made Marx kind of right if there was no other solution to it. Turns out there were other solutions, which are antitrust laws and anti-monopoly.
I've got my problems with those laws, but we can set that aside or dive deeper.
That's fine. I'm just saying that we had other solutions that didn't require us to have a revolution and blow up society and give the power to, say, Lenin. And so this basically what the Marxists of the 1960s were arguing was that all of these changes, including the budding civil rights movement, all of these changes were causing a change in the capitalist society where the worker is no longer the person who's cheated. The worker's middle class. The worker's got a life. The worker has a decent life that he's proud of. It's modest. Maybe he's got his one, he's worked his 30 years so he can buy his Corvette when he turns 55 or whatever it is that makes him happy. And that pissed them right off, because now economics is no longer going to be, for a century, actually 120 years by that point, they had been believing that economic conditions are fundamentally the maker of man, And it's not going to work in an advanced economy like the United States or Britain or Canada or whatever else. You need some other line. Herbert Marcuse, the kind of arch neo-Marxist, wrote this explicitly. He said, we need a new proletariat because the worker has been stabilized and turned conservative and even counter-revolutionary. Where did Marcuse say to look? He said, in the feminists, the ghetto population, as he called it, the racial minorities, the sexual minorities, the outcasts and outsiders, which would be criminals and mentally ill and so on. Those people, he said, have the vital need for revolution. They have the energy to carry out a revolution, even if they're not the actual basis for the material revolution and transformation that we need in society. And so this whole apparatus of oppressor versus oppressed in the West shifted into identity politics, which actually followed Mao Zedong, which he constructed identity categories out of Marxist theory, but used those in the Cultural Revolution. Marcuse was aware of it and proud of it and copied it. And we come up with this identity politics that by the 70s, late 70s, so that's like 68, 69, with Marcuse a decade later, by 77, the Combahee River Collective is writing about the seeds that become eventually intersectionality, which is how you kind of fuse all of these disparate identity politics struggles into one struggle. And, you know, Angela Davis is a bridge there, Marcuse's student, member of the Combahee River Collective, goes on to inspire Kimberly Crenshaw, who defines intersectionality. Intersectionality turns out to be like the super weapon in all leftist spaces that allowed them to consolidate power to their own vision better than anything. Why? Because any leftist, anything that was doing anything in the world, so that I say leftist because they have to be sensitive to the leftist style of argument. So let's say you have this great feminist organization that's plowing ahead with feminist whatever. It's very effective. It's very powerful. Maybe it's not great in the objective sense of great, but it's very effective, right? All you have to do is show up and call them racist and say they're too white, and all of a sudden you can bend the organization to your will. And let's say that it's a racial organization. You can say that they're sexist or that they're homophobic or that you have 10 different weapons you can deploy. And what happens in virtually every case in a leftist space is they all fight with each other. The whole thing melts down, it fragments, and then out of the ashes, let's say, of the critical legal studies movement, which was destroyed in 1985 by exactly that accusation of racism at the heart of their movement, turns around by 1989 and you have critical race theory replace it. So they had this power seizing and power consolidation mechanism par excellence. But anyway, all they're doing is answering the question of, in our society, in our advanced economy, our post-civil rights economy, in our society, our culture, how is man produced? Well, it's not his economic conditions. Most of us are middle class and we're pretty stable. There's some rich people, there's some poor people, and there's the issues around that. But most of us are solidly middle class. We're pretty conservative about that. We're going to protect our middle class existence. The production of what it means to be a person for the average person isn't in their economics. It's in their identity categories. Am I white? Am I black? Am I male? Am I female? Am I gay? Am I straight? All these cultural politics issues became the dividing strategy. And the seizing the means of production meant seizing the conversation around each of those identity issues that were core to who people think they are. What you get out of that, with one extra piece that I'll save for a moment later in the next part that you wanted to talk about at education, what you get out of that is this Frankenstein's monster, Mandami, Palestine flag today, trans flag tomorrow, apparently nonsense movement that's just pulling the same Marxist wedge game, the division game across that line of stratification of resentment upward in whatever dimension works today. And when that dimension stops working today, they switch to a different dimension tomorrow. Run it till it stops working, switch to another one. Run it till it stops working, switch to another one. And they can do this, they can code switch if you want, literally on a time scale of years or weeks or months or hours or single conversation. They can be talking about, the Palestinian conflict and switch to queer right in the middle of it with no blink, with nobody doing anything, because the underlying logic is still the same. All of the oppressed are oppressed not by the same thing, but in the same way. Therefore, one oppression is homomorphic to another oppression. And if you understand the logic of one, the logic of the next is the same. And in some sense, therefore, everybody who's oppressed is in some weird solidarity with one another. So they basically were able to create the conditions of the Cultural Revolution using the Marxist model in a kind of kaleidoscopic spectrum of different issues. But it's all still the same first sentence of the Communist Manifesto. The history of man is the history of antagonistic classes, which are, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed, with the piece in the middle that I left out being, it doesn't matter what oppressor versus oppressed group you choose. It changes throughout time and in different locations.
So just to replay that at that Marcuse moment, you have in Marx the time in which he's writing. And of course, Marx is so funny a character when you look into him in any depth, right? Because he's living at the benefit, he's living off of his buddy Engels.
And his mom and Engels' parents and or something.
He's, when he's not
His wife's
writing,
parents, sorry.
he's like, they're running off to mock people at church. He's sort of fundamentally despicable as an individual.
Yeah, he drinks a lot. He doesn't bathe, like, on principle. I brought this up with somebody recently, like, well, I don't think a lot of people were bathing in the middle of the 19th century. Like, it wasn't an everyday thing. I'm like, no. He was actually fundamentally opposed to bathing as like a
he's covered
bourgeois
in boils.
imposition. Covered in carbuncles and boils and skin diseases,
And this is, he could technically be right and be a disgusting, evil person and still come up with good ideas. So but the fact, it's interesting and noteworthy that he is really sort of through and through, like, disgusted by the world. What's the Faustian quote that he says is his favorite? All that exists deserves to perish.
That's right. Ruthless criticism of all that exists, because all that exists deserves to perish.
So you have this person who's and he exists at a time, and I think this is important, when the world is starting to be very rapidly transformed by industrialization. So you have this sort of flat period of most of human existence that hasn't changed very much in terms of the material conditions of man. And then along comes this set of technologies. You could say it's kicked off, by the printing press and literacy and then the Enlightenment. But there's this moment in the 1800s where suddenly change starts to go vertical. The steam engine, the transportation, and then so on and so forth. The automobile, the airplane, all of the things. The Industrial Revolution. And so that upheaval moment, which has parallels today in a lot of respects, you could say, is like the environment in which he's talking about how important these material conditions are for the nature of man. And one piece, you didn't mention this, but this phrase, the immiseration of workers, is a fundamental prediction of Marx, as I understand.
That's right.
Marx, that because capitalists will compete and there is a reserve army of unemployed people out there that they can always draw on to drive down wages and also drive down profits. So he recognizes the capitalists beat each other up and drive down profits. You will end up with a mass of miserable workers who have been bled to death. And so here's the United States of America, the most economically liberal in the classical sense, free market economy the world has ever seen, with strong protections for me and you as consenting adults to come to an agreement and have the courts uphold it. That's what private property actually is. It's just an agreement between adults.
Yeah.
That gives rise not to the worker immiseration, but a middle class.
Yeah. Exactly.
And people can talk about, oh, well, that's because of the union movement. I think that's not true.
I don't think that's true.
I think it's productivity. I think it's competition. You could say it's also the Protestant work ethic. There's a bunch of stuff. But the fact is, his prediction doesn't play out.
And that's what Horkheimer said specifically. He said Marx predicted that capitalism would immiserate the worker, but in fact, it allows him to build a better life. Direct quote from the founder of critical theory.
So here's the part that's so important for me, and I think for people that are trying to grapple with when they hear people like you and I talk about communism, and they're like, what are you talking about? There is something in the minds of those people like Horkheimer. Repeat that quote from Horkheimer again. I just want to make sure, because I stepped on you a little bit. It's really important.
That Marx predicted that capitalism would immiserate the worker, but it in fact allows him to build a better life.
And he saw this as a problem, right?
Yeah. That's a problem that you have to figure out how to get around, because they believed, the critical theorists believed, that there was this new flattening out of life by the capitalist program, so that, like earlier when I said that, you work hard your whole life so that by you turn 55, you can buy your Corvette and you have your cool little toy you've wanted, and you've been a car guy your whole life. You finally got to get your little race car, in the driveway. You're out washing it and waxing it on Sunday after church or whatever. And what he's saying is, what their argument is that the logic of capitalism actually steals away your ability to see an even better socialist existence, because you live your life by going to work all day and working your part, doing your thing to earn your meager, middle class existence. Meanwhile, Chevrolet is over here advertising Corvettes to you all along, so that by the time you finally get the kind of nest egg where you might be able to move upwardly, you blow it on a Corvette. And so you're just part of the system of capitalism being capitalistic. And this is what the kind of essence of so-called one-dimensional man, as Herbert Marcuse wrote it, is that the logic of capitalism teaches people to work to make a little bit of money so that they can get sucked into the capitalist system and blow it all on capitalist stuff that they don't need, what he called false needs versus true needs.
So I want to linger on this moment in intellectual history for a reason, because when you have a theory and you assert a prediction, and Marx, as I understand it, believed himself to be doing science, that this was a social science.
That's right.
Scientific socialism.
It was the only scientific description of history, according to him. The only one.
Yeah. So he has his science, and he makes predictions, and those predictions don't work. So there's obviously a couple ways you can respond if you're like a big fan of Marx and you know what he's predicting and you're like, this didn't work. One is he's wrong, right? And I rethink my position, and and then you try to understand, well, what did he get wrong? One is he's right, but we need to wait a little longer. This is the old real Marxism has never been tried, or the stimulus didn't work because it wasn't big enough. And how would you know? And what are you using to measure? So he's wrong. There's no, it's still, we just need to keep on waiting. We'll just let Paul Samuelson keep publishing textbooks in which there's a graph of the Soviet Union eclipsing the United States economy. And that never happened, but he kept publishing the same book with the same graph and changing the dates.
Oh, yeah.
The most famous
nuclear power or nuclear fusion's 25 years away every year for the last 50 years.
Yeah, it's like 1988, and Paul Samuelson's economics textbook, which is like the most popular one at the time, is being published with the same graph, and then the whole thing collapses, and there's no apology.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but then there's this other response, the response you're talking about, which is, okay, no, we acknowledge the prediction didn't hold, and that we're not saying that we can wait it out and it'll still be true. But we still want communism or something.
Yeah.
So let me just finish, and then I want you to go at it, because here's the part I'm trying to grapple with here in real time.
Uh-huh.
What that suggests to me is that there is something, there is like a deeper goal that isn't exactly what Marx said specifically. You're not being motivated by helping the working class because the working class are doing better and you don't care. So if it's like the issue is never the issue is always the revolution, and we'll just keep shifting the goalposts, only you're literally talking about all of reality. Like, what do they want? Like, why? What was the underlying motivational force in your view, having read all these people, that
Power.
caused? But to what end? Just to be a selfish dictator? Like, how?
Yeah, more or less. Actually, if you look at the way that the Communist Manifesto is structured, you get that. And by the way, what you're looking at, this logic, this third answer that you bring up, this logic is the logic of a cult that has been disproven. It's the UFO cult where the UFO never showed up. And Leon Festinger was pretty clear in the 50s showing that when you're in a cult and then the central doctrine's disproved, most people don't leave the cult. They actually become stronger in the cult, but they make the central beliefs of the cult less falsifiable. In fact, maybe unfalsifiable. The UFO actually did come and it stopped whatever thing, and then they went away happy or whatever, but nobody could see it because it's, stealth or whatever, cloaking device, some unfalsifiable claim. And this is what the critical theorists did, is that they said, oh, the working class has a better life, but they don't have an ideal life, right? So what has actually happened is that they've been co-opted by capitalism itself. And so it's not capitalism as an economic doctrine, it's capitalism as a culture that has co-opted all of them to keep them in their immiseration to the point where they can't even see the fact that, they have a comfortable life, but they don't have an ideal life. And I'm not joking, that's what they did. But this is the logic of a cult. But this goes back, when I said what they're after actually is power. That Marx was, as Eric Vogelin called him, an intellectual swindler. And he's very specific. Vogelin is very, very specific when he says this, is that Marx wasn't wrong. Marx knew he was wrong and said it anyway. He's a swindler. He's very clear on what he means by this. He knows Marx knows by reading Marx that it's not really what he's about. It's not about the working class at all. And the structure, in my opinion, of the Communist Manifesto, I don't remember Vogelin's argument for it, but the structure of the Communist Manifesto actually shows this. Okay, so taking out all of the stuff, there's technically 4 chapters. The third one is just them arguing with people that aren't there. The fourth one is like a page, and then there's a bunch of preface and ancillary stuff afterwards. The main body of the manifesto is chapters 1 and 2. In fact, if you ask me what it is, it's what the Communist Manifesto should be. If you were going to read it straight through, it would be preface, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, with chapter 3 is just kind of like them arguing with people they disagree with. And then there's a bunch of lists of their demands, the history of how the document came to be, and so on. Okay, so chapter 1 is titled Bourgeois and Proletarian, and it explains the intrinsic relationship of society in this oppressor-oppressed conflict. That's why it opens the way that it does. And it explains that the bourgeoisie actually produces the proletariat, which is its negation in the kind of, dialectical framework. It produces that by exploiting it. And then the proletariat can come to realize that they are that exploited class who is part of the dynamic of exploitation. They're not just an exploited class. There's a bigger picture, and they're part of it. So you can awaken to being part of the dynamic of history, even when you're oppressed by the dynamic of history.
This is class consciousness.
That's right. And so then the second chapter is titled Proletarians and Communists, or maybe it's Communists and Proletarians. I forget which order the two words go in. But it's to explain the relationship between the Communist Party and the proletariat. Okay, and what Marx explicitly says is that the communists disagree with the proletariat nowhere at all. They're just its most advanced form. They're the part that understands the issue the most. Therefore, they're the necessary leaders of the proletariat. Okay, so chapter 1, the proletariat is a revolutionary class that needs to overthrow society in the name of the proletariat. Chapter 2, that will be led by the communists, who will then have to make sure everything goes according to plan. So then you end up with this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is going to be run not by the proletariat, but by the Communist Party, which is the logic of chapter 2. So the whole thing is, we, the communists, are a new elite who are going to use your worker manpower to overthrow the system, to install us as your new leaders because we care about you. But then you go one step further and you say, at the time when they were writing this, who was in charge of the Communist Party? And it was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So it was who was going to run, if they would have been able in, say, 1850, Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848, let's say they pulled off a revolution through Europe in 1850. Who would have been the boss? Who would have been in charge? Karl Marx would have been king of Europe, the communist king, not really a king, of Europe. So the whole thing is a boondoggle to put the leaders of the Communist Party through the Communist Party as its Praetorian Guard, as the leaders of the new society that has deposed the old society and gets to amass all of its riches to itself. So the point of communism has always been to amass the maximum amount of power and money in the smallest number of hands who are considered ideologically in line enough with the Communist Party itself and its leadership. So it's always just been a power grab. The whole thing is like Karl Marx's character comes into play here. You have a bunch of dysfunctional louts who think that they should run everything and the world would be better if they did. And they're trying to motivate the working class to do their dirty work so that they can become the new bosses, using all these intellectual swindles that trick people into thinking that, it's actually in the benefit, in the name of the working class. So that's what's really going on. So then when it doesn't work and they can't get power that way in the West, and if you look over at Soviet Union, yeah, they have power, but it's like something bad's going on over there. Like even by the time Horkheimer's, the quote I gave you from Horkheimer is actually from 1969. So this is all after, Khrushchev's secret speech. So by that point, everybody knew something bad was going on in Soviet Union, even by the 1930s, to a degree, but nobody knew how bad it was until Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. After 1956, that's it. Everybody knew what was going on in Soviet Union was a disaster.
Since our school system only ever teaches our kids about the evils of the Nazis and spends virtually no time on the greatest murderers in all of modern history, the communists.
Yeah.
What is that speech? Just recount real quickly. What is Khrushchev's speech in 1956 and why is that such an important moment?
Historically, just very lightly, Stalin died in 1953. Obviously, Stalin was, let's say, a figure of power, to put it mildly. So this creates an enormous power vacuum. Nikita Khrushchev ends up filling that vacuum by rising up to, head of the party. And he can't basically get the Soviets under his control. And so the way he decides to get the Soviets under his control is 3 years later in 1956, he comes forward and gives what's called his secret speech. I actually don't know why it's called the secret speech. I should look that up and find that out. But he gives this speech. It's called Khrushchev's secret speech, where at least to the party Congress, but eventually it goes to the world, he confesses to all the crimes, the brutality, the murders, the mass murders, the genocides, the Holodomor, everything that Stalin did, and that he did it intentionally. So he gives this long speech blaming it all on his predecessor, which means all of the people who were the, post-Stalin Stalinites who were still vying for power and causing problems, all of a sudden get cast down as the great evil monsters who cannot possibly be allowed near power. And obviously the Soviets lived it, so they knew when he said it that it rang true. So it created the ability for Khrushchev to consolidate his power by blaming everything on his predecessor, by confessing to the crimes against humanity of Stalin that were at that point unparalleled in the world in anything that had ever happened.
The liquidation of the kulaks, the mass murder of Ukrainians, the intentional starvation of millions of people.
Also even just smaller political murders where, he would pick people that were in his inner circle and, intentionally just murder them, kind of as a show of force or because he just wanted to, or, different motivations to initiate various purges or accusations or whatever else. So it all comes out in 1956. So by this point, what's going on with the critical theorists is they're trying to figure out, they want to have, you can say that they're after power, or you can say that they're religious fanatics, which I think is another component to the argument that's very important. Stalin, probably more of a cynical power broker, maybe fully believed it. Marcuse, I don't know if he wanted power so much as this guy was literally utopian. Like all the critical theorists had given up on the utopia vision, and Marcuse brings it back. He's like, no, guys, it's possible. We can get the ideal society. So you start thinking of, you go off in like fantasy land about the ideal, perfect functioning society. which is always characterized, by the way, by exactly the same thing: a reduction in the working hours of the day. They want to not work. That's it. The ideal society is one where nobody has to work and there's plenty for everybody all the time. That's the whole goal. And when you look at how they implement things, that's exactly what they're after every single time, is less work for everybody, which turns out less productivity, which means no abundance, which means people die in starving and freezing conditions. But at any rate, they might just be high on the Kool-Aid, but they're utterly convinced that they can get there if they can just retool the theory and locate the issue somewhere else. So their argument was not that Marx was so much wrong as that Marx could not foresee that the capitalists would co-opt the circumstances that should have been their own demise to their own advantage. So it's basically that the capitalists are even trickier than we thought. But the basic idea isn't wrong. It's just that there were certain parts of the unfolding of history that Marx, based on his limited data in the Industrial Revolution, could not have foreseen.
One of the pieces of the puzzle that you've talked about, which is, you tell the story of the, working class guy at the factory, at the Ford factory in like Detroit in its heyday that can buy a Chevy, or no, he'd buy a Ford Mustang, let's say, for himself. Yeah. And isn't this wonderful that he's been fundamentally brainwashed, that there is this susceptibility to brainwashing on the part of the public that makes them dupes and dopes. Oh, well, the reason why Marx failed is because class consciousness was stifled by the capitalists who propagandized the public into thinking that all they needed to do was buy a Mustang, and then they would, and they sort of, it's like a release valve on the pressure building towards utopia.
Yeah, it's happening right now too, right? Like, we all think Sydney Sweeney is hot because American Eagle decided to put her in a jeans commercial.
Yeah, like, we're being brainwashed by Sydney. So the latest form of Nazism is celebrating Sydney Sweeney's genes, let's say.
Yeah.
The part in there that if you don't have to scratch that hard is, if you believe this, if you believe that people are that stupid, you can't possibly justify democracy. Right? Because how can you have a democracy in which the public has any say in its form of government, never mind taking stuff by force, but just any say at all? Because well, the public is dumb, and they can just be convinced of anything that anyone tells them, and the capitalists are especially good at this. Like it's so instantly. Like, where do you go from there? Because people like Mondani and AOC, they all call themselves democratic socialists, but their assumptions are anti-democratic to the core, right?
I mean, that's what Lenin's party was the Democratic Socialists. So before they changed the name to the Bolshevik, before they changed the name to the Communist, it was the Democratic Socialist Party. Okay, so here's the evil part. Like, we haven't touched about the evil part yet, right? The fanatical part. But here's the evil part. When you conclude that the vast masses are actually basically simpletons who are very easily brainwashed, and that this is the nature of society, but you understand the true nature of their humanity, which is that they're ultimately socialists who can live in a liberated society of plenty with no work, you go to seize the means of production of what? Them. Through economic conditions, through social conditions, through cultural conditions, it doesn't matter what it is. You go to seize the means of production of them. Marx called this the inversion of praxis. Praxis is the activism you do in the world, so you change the world, and then the changes of the world brainwash people to think this is the way that it is now, and so they become the results of your activism. And so what you do is you establish a state that claims to be democratic later. Only the people who understand the theory get to be democratic now. Only the communists get to vote. Only the awakened socialists get to participate, because everybody else is too stupid, and they're brainwashed, and they're trapped by false values, and they're trapped in false consciousness. So they have to be excluded from the ability to vote in order to allow the democracy to be pure. which obviously just means only the people who vote for us and agree with us get to vote in practice. And the goal is to set up a state. This explains the gulags. This explains the ideological remolding programs in prisons in Mao's China. This explains basically social emotional learning and all the educational manipulations that we have with our kids, education for social, or for what, global citizenship education, education for sustainable development, and so on, that our kids are getting exposed to. Your job becomes to take all the people who haven't already got it and to brainwash them, because that's what you do with those people. So the Soviets say, capitalism brainwashes everybody. So what we'll do is take power and brainwash people the right way so that they'll be socialists. So then we won't need to have this program anymore when they're all socialists. And well, what do you do with the people who are, say, too stupid or too stubborn or too faithful in a lot of cases for the brainwashing to work? You kill them. You get rid of them. You make examples of them too, the most grotesque ways that you can. So the evil comes in from believing that they are absolutely right, that the mechanism for dealing with dumb people is societal brainwashing, and that they have every right, therefore, to brainwash them into the correct ideology and out of the evil ideology that is withholding them from their true humanity. So that's where actually the whole evil mechanism comes from. And this is that idealism again, that they have the ideal vision of what a person should be in the ideal society, the completed perfect society where we've returned to our true socialist nature that's deep hidden within us, that we have been estranged from is the language, self-estrangement through private property. And we're going to free you up of those beliefs. We're going to get you to the right way of believing. And if we can't, we'll have to get rid of you because you're a problem for the collective and for the party. And that justifies literally all of the horrific evils that they do from their own perspective. That they're literally everything. I was going to say education, but it's in the broadest sense of the word. Every single thing that happens in the development of a human being is a form of brainwashing. But the socialists are the only people on earth who have the awakened right idea. So they have every right and, in fact, a duty to brainwash everybody and to get rid of the undesirables who can't take it.
So
this is why they call it a transformative practice, by the way. This is why they speak in this religious language almost of being born again. You actually have some people who do speak in the language of being born again as a socialist. You must die and be reborn, or die and resurrect on the side of the oppressed. That's a direct quote from one of the critical education guys, Henry Giroux.
So one of the things that seems like a pattern, and I'm curious if you would say this holds up, since you've surveyed this landscape of intellectuals, is very much that it is driven by intellectuals, artists, writers, people who can create. One way to think about the group of people that get most excited about this might be, I want to test the thought with you. Those who find fulfillment in activities that they can do by themselves. So, and so what do I mean by that? Well, I'm an intellectual guy. So are you. We're having this kind of heady conversation. If you're an academic, you can sit and write a paper and your product is yours, and you didn't have to deal with buying tools, really. Of course you did, because you needed a pencil and paper at a minimum, or you got a computer, but never mind that. Let's say you're writing in your own blood on a tree bark you pulled off a tree yourself. There's a kind of lack of the alienation that comes with what we're doing right now, which involves cameras and all this technology that involves massive decentralized supply chains of anonymous people trading over time and inventing the chips that go into this thing. All of that's alienation. But the most pure humanity is that creative, that writer, that thinker, that can operate in a world that isn't bothered by messy things like reality, like physical reality, like the kind of reality you get when you have to swing a hammer and you have to sort of get a door to be square and plumb, and you drew it perfectly on paper, but then in practice, the wood you got's a little off, and you've got to shim it. And reality stuff teaches people that utopia is kind of a scam. It's a mental exercise. It's not real.
Yeah.
But if you live in the world of nothing but pure ideas and academia, and the arts is adjacent to this, I can just have paint. I'll paint my own blood with bark, and I'll make a beautiful picture with no need to have any kind of use of a supply chain. Is there something about that, that you find like at the level of the individual experience of the people that buy into this? I mean, Mamdani's the son of a filmmaker. It's a perfect example. It's like this sort of the creative arts as the full expression. Like working in a widget factory is just dehumanizing to them. And I just wonder how much of that tangible experience of the academic lies at the heart of the kind of thought processes, as opposed to simply being like persuaded by the ideological argument.
Yeah, I think that all you have to have is something kind of like that combined. I don't think it's being persuaded by the argument. I think it's actually the emotional resonance precedes believing the argument, which is often resentment or envy. There are some data showing that, downwardly mobile elites are the ones who are most likely. So you have Mandami, who's, the son of these very successful people, who is not going to be as successful, he's not as talented as his parents. I mean, whether they're good or evil doesn't matter. And so what's he got to do? Well, this is his ride. But there's also a certain, there has to be a certain narcissism there as well. And I think it has to be a certain type of narcissism. The grandiose narcissism is not as likely, I think, to stick here. But the wounded or vulnerable narcissist who is in that kind of position, Marx definitely overestimated the value of what he was doing. He thought that he should basically be literally leader of the freaking world if the Communist Party took over through worldwide revolutions and he's at the top of the party. He thought he should be leader of the world because he had all these brilliant ideas that nobody would pay attention to because they were actually crap, to the point where his mother actually wrote him a letter after Marx begged her for money again, saying, Marx, Carl, you write a lot about capital and it would be nice if you earned some. But the reason that it's not that he wasn't, I mean, he's a prolific writer. It's actually frustrating how much the man wrote if you try to read his works. There's just, every time I'm like, okay, I need to suck it up and read this other thing. And I go get the PDF or whatever, I find it, and I'm like, 370 pages. And I'm like, my God, could you write something that's like 15 just once? It's like everything's a book. He wrote so much. It's insane. It's like his notebooks on the side of Capital, which is called the Grundrisse, is like 900 pages of just like notes turned into a book, sort of. It's like, oh my God, stop. So it's clear that the man had capability to do something, and he had talent. He, obviously had a command of the dialectics. He had a command of the philosophy to a degree. He apparently could rabble-rouse some people to a degree, but he couldn't produce value for other people is the problem. So you have to have that entitled, wounded narcissism in combination with that. He's not the artist or the thinker or the writer who's in love with his project. I mean, clearly he was, but making it because he loves it, come hell or high water, come pay or no pay, or finding a path to, get patronage so that he can actually do it, in an esteemed way. Nope. He was an entitled, narcissistic jerk who believed that the world owed him not just a living for doing what he was doing, but to be in charge of the whole frickin' planet. So you've got to have that other ingredient. And I think that ingredient is actually almost crucial. But the thing is I think that can be inculcated by people who get kind of pulled in. But the vector that pulls people in a lot of cases is that creative type you described, and your work should be more valued than it is. You do great drawings, and you can't even sell them for $5 a piece because people don't want drawings. And so, of cartoon characters or whatever it is you draw. So, you should be more valued than you are. And you start to inculcate that wounded narcissistic entitlement into people, then the theory becomes like the feed that attaches to that to run the cycle deeper. I think that that's kind of the mechanism, but it all starts with thinking that probably in most cases, this intellectual work that you're talking about should be more valued than it is, and you should be more valued than you are. And that, I think, is the emotional hook. And then you just off to the races. Plus, I mean, the other side of it is, let's just be real. These ideologies, all of the Marxist species, because they're all about fomenting grievance from bottom up, create the opportunity for grifters that is unparalleled by virtually anything else. Anybody that can fit in any way whatsoever as a champion of the victim class has a pathway to success that they don't deserve anywhere, because they're producing no actual value for anybody, anywhere at all that mentality takes hold. So if you create, an oppressor versus oppressed dynamic across, any particular, I'm trying to think of a completely benign left-handedness, right-handed versus left-handed. I'm trying to think of something that, there's not some hidden coded meaning behind somewhere. Like I was going to say noses, but it's like,
Well,
oh no, they're going to say something about the Jews.
There's the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. I mean, we have the easy replicatable experiment that you can turn people against each other with a completely random identity marker today. You can get 10 kids, run the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment, and and they will turn on each other.
That's right.
And then give half of them a random armband and then say the reason why we gave it to you is because we actually knew in advance that you're the superior crowd. You get to sit in front. By the end of the day, you've fomented hate.
Right. Now, imagine you have just enough people in that crowd where somebody in the no armband crowd, right? Or somebody in that crowd has grifter mentality, right? And they realize that they can basically become the champion of the no armbands and just get resources amassed on them, not because they believe in the cause or they think anything's real about it or they actually think there's an injustice, but just by speaking to that injustice. And that you can also get somebody who does have an armband on and say, for purely grifter reasons, I'm not saying that they're moved with their emotions. I mean, we're saying in grifter sphere here, who's like, there's a huge reservoir of me being able to siphon off of the people with no armbands as long as I pretend to care about them with my peers that do have armbands. And so the opening for the grifter space becomes humongous here. So you end up attracting psychopaths and, again, rent seekers, the kind of people that basically drive your situation into the dumpster and basically rob your circumstance or your society blind, actually become not just successful, but eventually the most successful in this architecture that's built around this wounded narcissistic dark fantasy about how the world works and should work instead to cater to their needs.
Friedrich Hayek lays out an argument, a compelling one, in his book *The Road to Serfdom*, why the worst get on top, and you've just basically articulated it, that in a world where you have totalitarian power at the top of the pyramid, like all the communist regimes the world has ever seen, what kind of person will win? It's the kind of person willing to slit the throats of everyone else.
That's right.
There's a book, I believe it is Love and Murder in Stalin's Russia, something like that. It's about a more idealistic socialist that was part of the inner circle at the Bolshevik Revolution named Bukharin, who many, as I understand it, look to and say, see, if he had become the leader, communism would have worked. And the part they miss, I mean, there's reasons why it doesn't work even if you've got a benevolent. You'd need someone who's God, not just benevolent, but also omnipotent and omniscient.
Yeah.
Because of the knowledge problems inherent in top-down planning of a society. You can't do it. It's literally impossible. It's not good in theory. But the politics and the psychology of it are laid so bare in this because you see firsthand the fact that the reason why you won't get a Bukharin, true benevolent idealist leader is because he's murdered by the guy that's willing to murder.
That's right. It's very simple. The guy who is is willing to murder and willing to play his fellows off of each other, which is what Mao did. Mao set up in his own inner circle at all times. He had at least one power play drama going between at least two characters at any given time. And usually he had entire factions going against, because if they're at each other's throat, Mao becomes the only solution to their problem. And then whoever's more loyal is the one Mao can, bless. And then he can use that blessing on the one guy to destroy the other guy. So you got to be willing to do the murder at the end of the day. So Stalin and Mao, I don't know as much about Lenin and his organizational principles. But yeah, these guys knew how to play people off of each other, and they were perfectly willing to do the murder. And that's who's going to end up on top every single time. Whether, I think Mao probably was a true believer in communism, having read an awful lot about him. Whether that person's a true believer or not is secondary to whether or not they're ruthless.
So, so we have this ideology rooted in this sort of toxic brew of narcissism, utopianism, and then word games like "we all own it," which doesn't mean anything. Because if you get 10 people in a room and say you all own X, you immediately realize that collective ownership is just a word game, because if 5 people want to do one thing and 5 people want to do something different, the conflict is immediate. Get 10 people to all agree on where you want to go for dinner and require it to be unanimous, and you'll see how quickly "we all own it" is just word games. It gets recast into an ever-expanding set of intersectional identity games to keep people from noticing that the fundamental predictions failed about the worker and about the material conditions of people in a society that's largely free and has private property and the rule of law and contracts and adults consenting to do things with each other without the state getting in the way, also known as capitalism, free enterprise. And then we start to get to the present and how this ends up playing a role in academia and K through 12 education, which is actually the area I care about the most. Academia feels fundamentally downstream at the level of the individual person and at the level of our kids. Because our kids, I think about, there was an article in Vox. I don't remember exactly when it was. It was at the start of our woke reign of terror. It was, "I am a liberal professor and I'm afraid of my students," was, I think, the title, or something very close to it. And it was a good example of how K through 12 and the culture around our kids had produced foot soldiers of nonsense. Cancel culture warriors, people screaming about their oppression.
Yeah.
What happened to take everything we've talked about and pump it into the machinery that delivers our K through 12 teachers?
Critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is the answer. So a Brazilian Marxist and liberationist, and to a degree post-colonialist, named Paulo Freire, who lived in Recife, in the 1960s, early 1960s, came up with a program he called Education for Liberation. And the idea of Education for Liberation was that, you're going to go among the peasants who are peasants and stuck in their lives. A lot of them live in these favelas, the slums of Brazil. And they do so because the society has changed in Brazil, whether through colonialism, whether through capitalism. And so now you have to be able to do things like read. You have to have professional skills to be able to get a decent job, to make enough money, to make a good living. And basically his claim was that this change had basically created these gigantic semi-urban, suburban favelas out of peasant categories. So what's the solution to this? Well, the prevailing belief was the solution was education. Well, this Marxist, and he's actually lightly a Marxist at this point and heavily a liberationist and post-colonialist. He becomes more Marxist later, develops a literacy program for the peasants. which he called Education for Liberation. It goes on later to be called Critical Pedagogy. And the idea is that he says that these people need to understand their conditions as much as they need to understand how to read, but they also don't want to learn how to read. They don't see that it's relevant to their lives. Therefore, we're going to use a political education as a motivating structure to get them interested in a, literacy education, or an actual education. So he comes up with this whole program where it's called the generative model, which he literally says himself he derived from Mao's mass line. And what he says is what we're going to do is to make sure that they're engaged enough to want to learn. We're going to ask the peasants in the favelas, why is it, what are the things that are going on in your life? And they're going to talk about slum problems because they live in slums, right? And so then he says what you're going to do is the educator is going to have long conversations with them to find out what all their problems are, what they're most frustrated about, where they're emotionally attached and engaged, because they're going to be interested in learning about that. Then they're going to codify the material. In other words, they're going to put a communist spin on it, is what it boils down to. And then they're going to use that to teach the students, okay, so you live in a slum, you live in a favela. Why do you live in a favela? Well, let's talk about that. And they tell them the communist spin on it. And then the punchline is, now you're interested in what's going on. Here's how you spell favela, and, Favela. And here are the syllables, and here's how you can learn how to read based on that. And if you can learn all this about your life in the favela from learning to read, imagine what else you could learn by learning to read more. And for a little while, this education program actually, for reasons that are kind of unique to Portuguese, was very, very successful at raising the literacy rates of people in the favelas, or at least it's been reported. I don't know if that's actually true. I haven't confirmed it, but that's the report pretty widely. I've not seen any disputing evidence saying that that's not the case, but it was like this kind of weird circumstance. But basically what it was doing was creating an army of radicalized people who could kind of read, rather than creating a bunch of people who could read, who could then integrate into the economy. And in fact, he called that process conscientization, which is a fancy word for awakening to what he called a critical consciousness, which was his update explicitly says so, that it's his generalization of a class consciousness. So class consciousness is when you're conscious of which class you're in. Critical consciousness is when you are aware of the oppressor versus oppressed conditions in all the dimensions of your life. So you can see that this is the piece that was missing from the story I told earlier.
So like
this gets picked up.
In an example in today, when my kid comes home from middle school, environmental sciences class, and is suddenly absolutely distraught over a story about water shortages and how they're climate change, and yells at me because I used a straw, and says I'm a bad father and a bad person because I'm using a straw. That's it playing out. That's exactly our modern experience.
That's literally exactly a perfect example of that. And so it turns out that this goes on to get picked up by Harvard in the mid 1960s. By 1970, he has his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, come out. He temporarily, for 6 months at the end of the 68 into 69, teaches at Harvard for 6 months. It was a 2-year appointment that he was offered, but he teaches there for 6 months because he also got offered whole separate can of worms, no time for this today, but he went and spent a decade in Geneva working at the World Council of Churches instead. So he only did 6 months at Harvard. This ends up creating like a little cult around the guy in Boston. Eventually in the 70s, late 70s, Freddie doesn't disappear, but he's not really relevant. But in the late 70s, a guy, Henry Giroux, who I mentioned earlier, has a bad day trying to do his stupid leftist classroom in a conservative school in Providence, Rhode Island, or Bridgeport, Rhode Island, one of the two places in Rhode Island, I guess. And he is going to quit teaching. He's done. He's having a bad day. It's falling down for Henry Giroux that day, referencing the Michael Douglas film. And somebody had given him a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, literally like a couple of weeks earlier, and like, you should read this. So he goes home dejected, decides to start reading the book, reads the whole, doesn't go to bed, reads the whole book, has a religious conversion experience. If you read his description of what happened when he read this book, goes manic, doesn't sleep for days. This is it, found everything. I now have the language, goes in carrying the book under his arm to his principal and starts like pointing at, frantic. The whole thing is a religious experience. He basically pushes really hard to start bringing Freire's influence into the education sphere around Boston, where he ends up going back to school. He does leave his job teaching in Rhode Island. He goes to Boston. I want to say university, but it could have been college. I always get this mixed up. One or the other. One of the big, flagship universities in the Boston area, though, one of the big famous ones. So he goes there and has a very famous education department, has a very famous conservative chair, and he's butting heads with this guy, and he's trying to force the opportunity to get Paulo Freire to come in and speak again. And one way or another he does. He has very obviously another the guy, Freire stays at his house, has another religious experience with the guy. The descriptions are just like lurid about staying up, drinking all night and crying and telling their stories. And like Freire's telling his stories about how he's like getting beaten and destroyed in favelas and like exiled from countries and like chased by the police. And then Henry Drew's like crying, talking about how like he got fired from his teaching job or something, like they're equal somehow. It's this dumbest thing ever, but it's this big deal. He writes about it in several books. And so this guy goes on a quest at this point. He has this total fanatical conversion. He calls it his praxis. That's the word he uses. And he says his most important praxis was from the end of the 1970s through 1984 or 5, during which he went around to as many colleges and universities in North America, some in Canada, some in the United States, as he could, and got radical educators tenured. And then in 1985, Freire publishes another book called The Politics of Education. Giroux writes the foreword to it. Harvard Education Review writes a glowing review of this book. And everywhere that he got people tenured picks up Paulo Freire in the wake of this. So that this is 85. By 1992, Marxist historians of education chronicle that they had generally established full control over colleges of education by 1992. So 7 years later from that, first domino falling or whatever, or I guess the first 100 dominoes falling, they had more or less complete control over the activity and output and standards for our colleges of education. So everybody who's been trained to be a teacher, education administrator, or anything that requires you to pass through a school of education has been boiled in critical pedagogy, which is to say critical theory as reformulated through Paulo Freire. And what Giroux did was brought in, quote unquote, the European theorists. And then the feminists and the critical race theorists latched on by the 80s and 90s. By 95 in particular, it was critical race theory was shot through. And so you ended up with this post-structural feminism, critical race theory, and critical pedagogy stew that defined colleges of education through the 1990s, such that by 2005, thereabouts, plus or minus 2 years, complete transformation of what colleges of education are producing. Everything's downstream from there. The logic's simple. You get the college of education, you get the teachers, you get the teachers, you get the students, you get the students, you get the future.
There is a set of graphs that when you overlay them together is very striking. And I want to play out a little bit of this timing. So you've got this takeover of these choke points in the process of our education system. The schools that train teachers. If I am a young student, I'm a freshman, I love kids, I used to tutor, I'm open-hearted, I'm going to be a teacher. Okay, you go to your high school counselor. Well, that means you should try to get into Johns Hopkins, or you should get a degree in education, and that's the path to being a teacher. And so as you're saying, so by the mid 90s, all of these places have been literally taken over by the very specific people that have been spread out across the country by this guy and then inspired by them. Yeah. And that becomes the new consensus. 95.
That's why I go to about 2005, is to give that 10 to 15 years of a generation or two of retires and hires
Yeah.
to play out.
So the set of graphs that this is reminding me of is that so Gallup had been tracking perceptions of race relations in America for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And as of the early 2000s through roughly 2013, they would poll people, Americans, enough to be representative in theory. How would you rate race relations in America? It's not how you feel. It's like, how do you think they are in general? And both whites and blacks in America broadly said, to the tune of 68 to 72%, good to very good, 68 to 72%, a super majority, both blacks and whites. Whites were a little more optimistic than blacks, but blacks were not within the margin of error. Between 2013, the last high point in which that's true, to 2015, it collapses. I mean, it's really like 2 years.
Yep.
And it's like, people could say, well, this is Obama, except Obama had been in power since 2008.
No, this was Obama.
And so,
very specifically, a certain thing Obama did.
Yeah, there's things that Obama did that play a role, but there's other pieces of the puzzle here. I'm not trying to dismiss Obama.
No, you're right. You're right.
But he had been
propaganda
in power. Yeah.
is like seeds, and if it doesn't have fertile soil to land in, it's not going to grow. So the seeds had to be there. So
the other two pieces, real quick, are the political divergence. I was just talking to Rob Henderson about this. The political divergence of boys and girls begins to widen rapidly at that same time, 2013. And it's not boys becoming right-wing trolls. It's boys being basically unchanged and girls becoming super left. Like radically so, especially in the past couple of years.
I don't blame Obama for that too.
And then the other piece, which is documented by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff and others like Jean Twenge, is like the collapse in mental health and the rise of the woke students coming in demanding safe spaces and trigger warnings and seeing the entire world through a kind of external locus of control of oppression in which I have no agency and everything about my life is a product of systemic this or that. Also 2013. So
not going to blame Obama for that.
So it sure seems like it tracks with Gen Z, the first generation to be fully educated in this system that had been constructed, is perfectly set up to be kind of a psychological disaster that's absolutely obsessed with race.
Yeah, sorry, the younger millennials and older Gen Z is where the first people who got fully immersed in this crap. And yes, so there's your fertile soil. Absolutely. Critical pedagogy starts getting pumped into the schools, like I said, into education. In California and maybe like Maryland and some states, it was way ahead of the curve. California was experimenting with this stuff a long time before. But, mainline, it didn't fully even get implemented into our schools till after 2015, and there were reasons for that. But it was starting to spread throughout schools because of this, generational strategy that had started to come to fruit. A lot of the curriculum was downstream from who's writing curriculum, who's setting ed policy, and so on. All of those people who were on, who was involved with, Obama's education transition team and education department. Those people went through these programs and were on the vanguard of these programs. Okay.
Yeah, and you get Common Core shoehorned into the stimulus bill in 2008.
That's right. It's a whole thing. And so what happened a bunch of things happened in 2012, 13. But as far as the race relations go, it wasn't that Trayvon Martin died at the hands of George Zimmerman. It was that Obama came out and said, he's the son I never had.
Yeah.
That absolutely sent a thunderbolt through race relations in the United States, believe it or not. And then that was in 12. His second term starts leaning into this identity politics a lot. And of course, BLM starts to come up out of the ground. BLM isn't a strong force until the end of 14 when Michael Brown dies. Hands up.
Ferguson, the Ferguson effect.
Ferguson, Missouri, that's right. And so that period of time was where you have this critically educated group of people. You have the pressing emergency coming out of the Obama education department that basically predicates off of the Trayvon Martin thing. And then you have this whole kind of like youth propaganda thing happening, so that it starts to tank in 2013 and it goes into a toilet by 2015 after you have the Ferguson, Missouri incident. Okay, so that's that. What about the girls? Well, the Dear Colleague letter that destroyed Title IX and created the female entitlement complex comes out in 2011, that the Obama administration's Office of Civil Rights wrote, that completely redefined the terms of Title IX in terms of, feminist things. So that's also the same agitations are there, but that's also downstream. I'll also add, though, that feminist groups started to get very active on college campuses between 2005 maybe and 2010 or 12. And I actually think this is this is not Obama's fault. This is, I think, one of the biggest pieces of that puzzle, is that young women, as they matriculate to college, which is a traumatic, psychologically challenging transition. You're now an adult, you're not in your parents' home, you're in a sexual environment probably for the first time, like in a significant way, no supervision, alcohol, drugs, plus all the responsibilities of college, all hitting you at once. This is a fertile ground for the narrative that had risen up in so-called third wave radical feminism, as it got called, whether you agree with the linear wave model or not. That's the name that was used for it, which was centered on this idea of rape culture. Rape culture, rape culture, rape culture. And the actual origin point, as far as I can tell, for the rape culture narrative comes from the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing in the 90s, where he was accused of having had sexual misconduct with, what was her name?
Anita Hill?
Anita Hill, that's right. I knew the Anita something.
I might be misremembering that, but
yeah, I'm like, I got the Anita part. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Well, you also have the Duke lacrosse,
of course,
scandal,
but that's
which is
further
completely
into this.
made up. I mean,
that's right.
It is interesting that, and this is something I hadn't been sensitive to until recently, that our kids, like so I'm 47. I have a 20-year-old son and a 16-year-old son, but to be in middle school when the culture, with smartphones, when the culture is obsessed with Me Too, which of course ironically emerges first and foremost out of Hollywood, and the people who, by literally the guy who said, "We are better, we are morally superior," Harvey Weinstein. That the sexual politics are so multi-layered and crazy, and here you are a 13-year-old boy struggling with your body changes and all the rest of it, and like, what a toxic stew to then have the ideology of the adults have already been captured by oppressed philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing has basically been a perfect storm through the 2010s. So the stage was really set for all of those large-scale changes there. I mean, Obama doesn't get all the blame, but he certainly contributed in very significant ways. I think more on the racial issue than on the sexual issue. But the Dear Colleague letter is not a trivial turning point, in which it's only recently been kind of overturned properly.
And as I understand it, this is a piece of guidance from the Department of Education that more or less nudges, let's say, universities to establish kangaroo courts.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And under the guise of Title IX.
The rape culture thing that was already building up. And I think that actually, literally, I think that not necessarily you can have whatever issues or love you want of earlier waves of feminism, so to speak, but third wave radical feminism deranged a generation of young women, just absolutely deranged a large number of them, actually broke them. And that became the fertile soil in which all of this intersectional crap, which, by the way, didn't really conquer and take over. It really started getting written about 1990, plus or minus a couple of years. It was 2005-06 before it became dominant in the academic literature around, cultural issues. And so downstream, again, 5 to 7 years, you have all these kids going to college. They're getting, a couple of classes of that. They're all starting blogs. It's all blog network vlogs on YouTube at the early
Tumblr.
YouTube. Yeah, well, Tumblr was its own whole freaking thing. Then there was like sexuality dimension way more than anything else. And so this whole stew was just, planted in the lap of this very vulnerable, already kind of misguided generation. Throwing in that element of, basically nascent social media becomes extremely important too. You have the first generation of people who are interacting more digitally than they are in person. And they're doing so under the auspices of all these weird social theories and all these weird, calamities that are going on with no maturity. We even like kids today, in a sense, have a slight bit more maturity about how to interact online because it's not brand new.
Yeah,
It's not the
true.
Wild West. There's some sense of what's going on and, some wisdom and lore that has been built up. That wasn't true in 2008 when Facebook opened up to the public or whatever. It was like everybody learned that their neighbor had terrible political opinions, and the person that you thought you could have a barbecue with was never allowed in your house again, like overnight.
There is something. It is a tragic story of modern history that this ideological, like Rousseau, envy plus utopianism metastasizes, and at its core, it makes assumptions that are fundamentally that the human being is a blank slate and nothing but the product of reality. It's this hyper materialism. All of that stuff is fundamentally hyper materialist. That you are the cause of nothing. You are only an effect of everything else.
Yeah.
And that comes about, it seems to me, right at a time where the internet delivers this experience, which is I get to build a blank slate identity.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I get to, whether it's like, I think of like World of Warcraft and building a character, like the character selector, starting with which gender should I pick? That's the beginning of every RPG. Like, pick am I going to be a necromancer? Am I going to be the warrior? It's like, maybe I'll be the female warrior.
Yeah.
And so you've got this like experience that's disembodied that then gives you something like living out the blank slate utopia in virtual space. Yeah. And then social media is just the sort of, speech version of that. It's World of Warcraft, but with words instead of swords and spells.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a gigantic ingredient. And so the timing of that lands at about the same time as well. Mm-hmm. And so the 2010s were really a perfect storm for this. And sadly, basically these things, these unique forms of kind of psychopathology, to speak a little bit like Jordan Peterson, upload very efficiently. Whereas, other forms of interaction don't upload so efficiently. Psychological manipulation, psychopathic abuse, harassment. Harassment has, this is the golden age of harassment. There's never been a better time to be a harasser if that's what you were looking to be. Like 40, 30, 20 even years ago, if you were a serial harasser of somebody, you always had to wonder if you were about to get your ass kicked behind a bar the next day, right? Like, you harass somebody, you finally cross the line, they found you, and they beat your ass, and that was the end of it, right? You can harass people from 30 different identities. Nobody knows even what country they're from. You're just a cartoon dog character or something. And you can get harassed by 30,000 people in a day now. It's a completely different universe for harassers. And there's absolutely no way to hold a lot of harassers to account. Harassment's always been, because we side on the side of free speech here in the US, very difficult to deal with legally. But now it's actually not even difficult. It's literally impossible. You can be not just harassed, but slandered and defamed, even stuff that merits defamation per se under the law, and you just can't do shit about it because the nature of the internet. The game has changed completely, and psychopaths including the people who have psychopathic ideologies and are acting them out, have a gigantic advantage in that field, whereas all the rest of us who have normal lives literally didn't see it coming. It sucker punched every one of us.
So what is your response to someone who hears this explanation and says, James, you've cited a bunch of examples, you've cited specific people, I will give you that, but you're still fundamentally engaged in a kind of narrative storytelling fallacy. You're drawing lines, connecting dots, and making it seem like this thread of, Rousseau, then Marx, bolstered by the Soviets, who basically propagandized Marx. He otherwise would have been forgotten if not for the Soviet Union. Then Marcuse, and then Angela Davis, and then Kimberly Crenshaw, and then in comes Paulo Freire, and this stuff morphs into this monster, and Mr. Henry gets it into the schools, and now here we are with a generation of people who've basically been hijacked by radical utopian psychopathy that makes their lives worse. That's this line. But in reality, things are complicated. It's a giant cloud. And you're telling an ideologically motivated story. It's just more complicated than that. And a lot of the reasons why this happened are good. This happened because this is actually the truth. And that's why it won, because the truth wins in the end. What's your answer to that kind of criticism?
Well, I mean, the last part's really easy to answer is Jesus gave some good advice on that, which is judge them by their fruits. Are the fruits really good? It's probably the fruit of a bad tree because it's not so good. Constant division, everybody stressed out, stuff falling apart. Everybody wonders if this election or that election is going to be the last election that we ever, we're not in a good place. Something's messed up, right? And so if we judge by the fruits, we know that somehow it's not that, even if some of the decisions were made for good reasons or with good intentions or whatever, the outcome has not been good. So we can already see that part. Now, the narrative storytelling, I'm a scientist by my original training, so I like this moment because what I've proposed is, you could say that it's an ideologically driven story. I would like to know which ideology drives it. That's fine. If you can articulate that, that'd be cool. Since you're asking me how I'd respond to it, I'm not challenging you at the moment. I'm just saying. But what I've actually built here is a model. We have a circumstance. That model, or that circumstance, evolved over time to get us here. And I've proposed a model. And you are perfectly free to propose a different model. And we are able then to sit down, look at the models, and see which ones meet the kind of criteria that we look for a mature model. Does it have explanatory power? Does it have predictive power? Does it have, a parsimony to how it's, the set of assumptions that have to go into it for how things have worked out? We can put forth an alternative model. For example, there's a character, I don't know him very well, but I've been very familiar with him, distantly for a long time before the Grievance Studies affair. He's recently put out a book, some of which I haven't read the book, but I've seen excerpts from it and discussion about it and a podcast about it. His name is Musa Al-Gharbi. He's put forth a book where, when I mentioned earlier, the downwardly mobile part.
Is this We've Never Been Woke? Is this the book?
Yes. Yes.
I have this. It's funny you should mention that. I was just given this book. It's sitting on my desk.
I haven't read it, so I can't critique it, and I'm not trying to do I haven't read this, I'm going to crap on him. I'm just saying he's proposed a different model. Okay, so I've proposed a model, he's proposed a model, and we can sit down. His model is different than my model. We can sit down now, and we could, in theory, have a discussion about various points of the model and to say, does this accord with the data? Does it provide explanatory power? Is the explanation that it provides sufficient to get us to the position that we're in, that we can see around us in kind of the measurable effects? Does it match not just some of the citations, but the totality of citations if we look at what, say, the actual relevant activists actually said and think? For example, Paulo Freire cites Lenin or Marx or Mao on virtually every single page, right? So, okay, it's pretty difficult to say that Marxism didn't influence this guy. Those are the kinds of questions that we can start to ask to compare the model. Ultimately, what we're looking for are models that are mature, so we can just throw out immature, silly models. And then, which means that they do have the capacity for prediction making. They do have the capacity for explanatory power. They are relatively parsimonious and so on. And then we can start to try to compare the details of the model. And ideally, it's not to say that the models will merge, but they might actually influence, pieces of the explanations within each one of them. But these are ultimately models. They're guesses about what happened. I think that what I'm providing, and I hope that, I don't know exactly, but we'll say Musa as another example of another model. I would assume that he believes that I assume he's a good faith actor, and therefore, like me, believes that the account that he's given is a high quality, if not superior, explanation from the information and data that we've been able to assess. I assume that that's what he's doing, that he's not a bad faith actor who's put forth a disingenuous or ideologically driven narrative, which is what that accusation comes down to. And I can assure you, maybe if there is an underlying ideology driving my critique, I would say that I'm certainly not aware of what that ideology is, because I'm trying to give a good faith presentation of the data as I've read it, to say, here's what Marx said, here's where that's faithfully reproduced in this book about critical race theory 200 years later. And the logic hasn't changed. It's just that the location of how that logic and where that logic's applied has changed. So that's what I would say to those people. Like, okay, fine, cool. I have a model. I've put forth a model. We can judge it on what merits it has. Let's do that. And you're more than welcome, encouraged, in fact, to put forth an alternative model, a similar model, a variation on my model, whatever it is that you want. But I'm not trying to carve out some position of power for myself. I don't have some vision with my model. I'm just aiming to inform people. So let's see my response to that kind of criticism is fine. Put up or shut up. Let's see your model.
One, I would say that there's a possibility here when you think about it like that, like what is a set of explanations that are robust. One, and they might all be true, or there might be several that layer together. And one that comes to mind that for me has grown as a share of my mind space personally is, and you've alluded to it, is what we are living through in part is the result of the decline of religion. And that and I would actually give this two parts. So let me propose an additional model that is maybe, I think fundamentally complementary. Mm-hmm. And I actually think, given when you look at the way Marx approached religion, they might even technically even be the same thing. Because Marx was fundamentally kind of satanic in the literal sense of being fundamentally against Christianity, against religion. He was against his own hereditary Judaism. He was there's a reason why the big communist countries of the 20th century were all explicitly atheist and persecuted the religious. Mm-hmm. So here would be my additional model I'd like to get your take on. We have seen a decline in religiosity in not just action, like going to church, but also in self-identified belief in God as the creator God of Christianity, being that Christianity is the dominant religion of the West. In recent decades, there's a very recent sort of resurgence, bounce back happening, especially among young men. Mm-hmm. But it's still small in comparison to the overall graph. That is paired with a decline in the family, and that those two things are actually quite closely connected, because there's been pretty good work done to show that actually the role of the father in the home is highly determinant for whether or not the kids actually go to church and participate in mass.
That's right.
So faith and the family have been receding in society against a backdrop of enormous comfort. And so you have these forces, these cultural forces that are not ideological, but that have left a substantial amount of Westerners adrift, while still having all of the needs that faith and family provide, there. So I still need community. I need a transcendental metaphysics that explains why I should care about others or believe in human dignity or choose X instead of Y for moral reasons. I need a sense of belonging. I need role models. There's all these needs that these things provided, in addition to, I think, as a Catholic, being true, as you know, in terms of faith claims. But we don't have to get into the particular faith claims. There's still a utility that I think emerges out of the truth.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
And that decline has basically been filled by this particular breed of wacky nonsense that's an alt religion that proposes an alt utopian heaven and has all of its trappings that look religion like, but are entirely materialist, entirely selfish, entirely driven by narcissism. So how do you think about that? Because it's not the same story, but there's feedback loops.
No, I think that it's likely to be possibly even a purposed part of the program, but they're certainly complementary. The analogy that I've given before is Marx's view on religion and atheism is basically that atheism is plowing the field so that the pseudo-religion of communism can grow in the now bare soil. So you've got to get the other beliefs out of the way that are preventing people from dealing with their real circumstances so that you can make them communist about their real circumstances. As you watch this decline in religiosity, you have to kind of ask some questions about why. Was it somewhat natural? Is it a result of having become more comfortable and having, more space? Is it because of the theory of evolution and the erosive effect that has in believing literally in a creator of all things? Is it, the increase of the scientific mindset or the emphasis on STEM that we saw, especially following World War II and World War I, actually? Is it, there are a lot of questions. Or was it driven purposefully by communists? I think it's an actually interesting story in the U.S. because a lot of the inroads that I made, part of the story I didn't tell because it's a huge story. A lot of the inroads the communists made into the American psyche were through religion more than through anything else. In fact, the piece of Paulo Freire's story that I didn't tell you, I said he was this communist or the Marxist, but he was a liberationist and he was a post-colonialist, but he was also a liberation theologian. He was deeply invested in the KGB project that perverted Catholic beliefs, Catholicism, into a Marxist construct, which was liberation theology was created as a deliberate perversion of Catholicism by the KGB, and it didn't take off almost anywhere in the world except South America. Well, it turns out that the priest or the bishop, Dom Elder Camara, was the bishop of the slums of Recife, and he was one of Paulo Freire's mentors. And almost everything he talks about his educational program as being prophetic. He's the one I actually misquoted. It's not Henry Giroux writing in the foreword to Paulo Freire's book that said that there's a death and resurrection on the side of the oppressed. That was actually Freire himself. Giroux talked about that and said that that's why it's actually a prophetic vision, which he then goes on to say, Giroux, I don't think being religious at all, goes on to say that Paulo Freire's goal was to use this mechanism to build the kingdom of God here on earth, basically under communist terms. And so the critical education program is derivative to liberation theology, but there were massive movements. Liberation theology, Black liberation theology, and the social gospel all had major impacts on the American psyche, especially through the middle part of the 20th century. Early part of the 20th century, the social gospel took off in Protestant circles, for example. And so by the middle of the 20th century, it was like, well, how do we care for the poor? What does it mean to care for widows and orphans? And a lot of this critical theory, basically, and Marxist thinking got brought in through the twisting of doctrines. We even saw that in COVID-19, it was love your neighbor, so get your vaccination, right? it was literally Kathy Hochul gives this long speech where Kathy Hochul gets up and says, it's a sacrament and you're my warriors for God, and I need you to go out and help your neighbors get vaccinated because you love them and that's what God wants and that's what God wants you to do. If you haven't seen this thing from Kathy Hochul, it's a piece of work.
No, I have to. Kathy Hochul. Remind me, Kathy Hochul.
She's the governor of New York.
Oh, right. Oh yeah, Kathy Hochul.
And she's wearing a necklace. It doesn't have a cross or a crucifix. It says "Vaxxed" on her necklace while she's doing this. It's an amazing piece of work, but she's literally copying. Again, it's a perversion. This is no blame to the Catholics for this. She's copying the Catholic structure of sacrament into the vaccine, to where even, your venial sins build up, so you have to go to confession again and get your booster. I mean, it's like, she doesn't phrase it that way, but it's like, that's the structure she's giving. It's unbelievable.
That's funny because she also got into a moment of social media hot water for doing a kind of mock Eucharist with a Dorito chip.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Video.
She totally did.
So doing
in a very gross kind of way too.
Yeah,
really weird.
It was a super weird video.
Yeah, I remember that.
So as we approach,
but just to close off, please. Say it, what you raised there is part of the story. It doesn't have to mesh in exactly. There were definitely deliberate attempts by the critical theorists to eject people from Christian belief. I mean, Antonio Gramsci famously said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Or overcome. I don't remember which one's the two words. So either way, this was a deliberate project to some degree. There were probably natural reasons why, religiosity fell off. It might just be the comfort hypothesis. It could also be life just got more complicated and busy. It's less structured. Then you mentioned the role of the father in the household. Well, that's also declined. And that data that you mentioned is correct. I mean, that's strong data showing that if the father is in the household and wants the family to go to church, they usually do, and otherwise it's here and there at best. And so that's all. I think these are all pieces of the puzzle, and we could attach them. I'm not trying to incorporate what you said into my model, but you can attach a lot of it, but not all of it, to various points within the constellation of what I've said that brings it as part of the drift. So I don't see that model that you're offering as strictly competitive. I do think that there are pieces like the liberation theology and social gospel aspect that require a little nuancing. Turns out, America was a tough nut to crack. The one thing I didn't say, and I'll just say this before we close out, I guess, is the way that I wanted to think of, or want everybody to think of Marxism is as like a viral agent that's trying to infect a body. The body is a society or a country or whatever. And viruses have to attach at certain receptor sites, as we all learned during COVID, the so-called ACE2 receptors or whatever, right? Well, it turns out that in industrial era Europe, or Soviet Union, and feudal societies in particular, actually, you could use the land and bread economic argument for peasants and workers to inject the communist virus in Soviet Union, Mao's China, kind of the Southeast Asian Rim, and so on, Cuba.
Much of Africa, actually.
Yeah, and that didn't work in actually capitalist societies. And then by the time you get to the American context in the middle of the 20th century, so-called advanced capitalist is what the communists called them at the time. Advanced capitalist societies did not absorb this either. So the virus still wants to attach. It has to in order to replicate. So it has to find different attachment sites. So the economic receptor is not going to work as the story of the critical theorist, because capitalism allows people to build a better life. So that's like having a molecule that's blocking your ACE2 receptor so the COVID virus can't inject its genetic material in. So fine, what does it have to do? It has to evolve to attach to a different receptor site. And it has in a sense, biological motivation to do that, or mimetic, in this case, motivation to do that, because it can only survive and continue by figuring out a way to inject. And so it turns out that race, sex, sexuality, gender, colonial status, blah, 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 were all weak points for the West. But the thing that I was actually adding in this particular case, and so that's how I want you to think about it, first of all, is that it's like a societal virus that has to mutate to find the particular weak points. What Paulo Freire's critical consciousness does is it creates the ability to go in and analyze the individual cells within any given community, find out exactly what the receptors are, and attach to those on purpose. So it becomes this kind of like, I don't know, Wuhan lab of being able to figure out how to attach the critical virus into any given specific context. And I mean that very seriously. But then the point is that America turns out to have been a particularly tough nut to crack for whatever set of reasons. And part of it, I think, actually has been its religiosity, such that rather than doing the communist thing of stamping out religion, it had to find ways to co-opt religion to get in the first place. It had to come in through religion, as opposed to by transforming it from within, by subverting it first, rather than by trying to kick the institution of religion out of people's lives. So again, there's a nuancing to that story, but they are complementary stories, I think, in a very important way.
It seems like, and there's stuff we could talk for 5 hours. We didn't talk about the flip side of this, which you've put forward this notion that the woke virus also has a sort of right-wing variant, which of let's call it like white European identity politics, let's say.
Yeah, or fascism as a reaction.
And there's a lot of good interviews with you on that. So we'll leave that for another time.
Sure.
I think that the one of the interesting things about where we are now that I'm curious to sort of close us out with is where there are genuinely maybe green shoots, where it feels like, sure, the schools are still brainwashed and super woke, but we can have this conversation and it will not get censored by YouTube. Heck, YouTube's even letting Candace Owens do hours upon hours on Emmanuel Macron's wife being a man.
Yeah, right.
And letting that get millions of views. So we're in a different world. There has been at least a partial recalibration from the woke reign of terror. And some of the other elements that seem to be happening is, especially among young men who have been beaten down as much as one group can by this time frame of going back to church, of sort of standing up and not acquiescing to this ideology, sometimes to excess, sometimes getting too off the rails with Andrew Tate type stuff. But are you optimistic that we're starting to develop cultural antibodies to this virus and its current strain? How do you think about that? And obviously,
that's a great way to put it. The antibodies, and it matches the virus thing I just said. As soon as people gin up the Sydney Sweeney thing, right? They immediately started to gin up all the narratives. Oh, there's racism, something about the genes. Oh, these are Nazi tropes. And literally, I think the world rolled its eyes. Like, we're just like, it's a commercial. Whether you like the idea of, pretty girls on commercials or not is one thing. If you want to call it sexualization of women or a commodification of bodies or whatever, like, A, fine, but B, who cares? But then when you start like I have good genes was a dog whistle for Nazis, it's like, stop. Just stop. We're not doing it. Just stop. And I see that kind of everywhere. It's very stark if you go to another country like Canada, where they haven't developed this, that you notice how different it is in America. Even New Zealand, which is kind of in this better place by comparison to, say, Canada. And we all have this horrible impression of how awful New Zealand is because of Jacinda Ardern and their COVID stuff. But it's actually, I was just there, it's like culturally, like it's woker than the United States, but people are just kind of like rolling their eyes at this stuff now. It's like, it's tedious. It's like, we're really still doing this. So yeah, I think we have developed cultural antibodies. And as a matter of fact, I think we've developed strong ones, right? So I don't know enough about virology to actually talk about this, or immunology to talk about this intelligently. So we're going to pretend that what I say is a correct description for metaphorical purposes. But like if you get, I think it's called cross immunization or something like this. Anyway, if you get one coronavirus, you have some partial protection against another coronavirus or another similar enough virus. That's all I need is that concept, right? So they tried to gin up, like imagine like just think back to the riots that broke out mid-June in LA over the ICE, right? And so they're throwing rocks at the cops. And first of all, there's that too. That's not just antibodies. There's like people wanted those guys arrested, and then the Trump administration delivered and they got arrested, and people celebrated the fact that they got arrested. So that's very different than 2020. Like they couldn't pull their little stunt this time because
JP Morgan wasn't going to put up a black square.
No, there's the law and order is back in business now. We're not doing this again. But more importantly, is like they came out, you know, doing donuts in intersections, setting cars on fire, waving Mexican flags. And people were confused about what was going on for approximately a day. And then they were like, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always revolution. We see straight through this. It doesn't matter if it's a Mexican flag or a Palestinian flag or a trans flag or a BLM flag. We know exactly what's going on here. We also know that it's not real. It's not what you're really about. You don't give a flying crap about anybody as immigrant, qua immigrant. You only care about the ability to leverage these aliens as a tool to try to bust up LA, and we're not going to do it this time. And so there's this kind of cross-protective antibody effect where even in a new context, we recognize the same playbook. And so there are lots of reasons for kind of hope that the leftist reign of terror is not likely on the cultural revolution scale, likely to catch fire again. I mean, I'm watching people, you know, eyeball Mondami basically dead to rights, you know, and I don't know that it's going to stop him from becoming mayor given the unique political circumstances of New York City. But like nobody's under much of an illusion about who this guy is or what's going on. Like it's very, very clear. And then people are using the dreaded C word, you know, not the one that you're not supposed to say, communism, the low status one, you know, the one that you sound like a crazy person if you say. They're outright. It's just he's a communist. He's a communist. He's a communist. You have major people saying this. You have senators saying this. You have, you know, people on television, the major characters saying he's just a communist, you know. And so this is a completely different environment. And I think our culture learned some things, and like you said, grew some antibodies, and I think it's actually a very hopeful sign. Like if you look at the, and not to get into the details, but at the right wing reaction is almost, it's its own virus, but it's almost like a cytokine storm. It's almost like our own immune system is going hyperactive and going too far, and causing a different kind of disease and danger. But that's still a sign of an immune response, right? I don't want to say it's a healthy immune response, but it's still a sign that it's like we don't have AIDS here, right? We're not just getting rolled.
Yeah, it's I think that my son went off to his first year of college this past year, and he would make fun of me for saying that's just communism, to things that he at the time didn't understand were connected. So he would come home and talk about some like gender nonsense. And I would say, well, that's all communism, Matteo. And he would say, Dad, everything's not communism. And it's like, and I'd say, no. And I would walk him through, like, sometimes from your site, like, no, here, look, here's Judith Butler talking about we need a communist ethics. Like, this is what this is. He came back, over the Christmas break and said, Pop, you were worried that I might go off to college and have get an infection of the communist variety. I'm even now I feel like I hear myself sounding more like you in the past 3 months than I was expecting. So you don't need to worry.
Well, he's already old now.
Right. But it is
not cool anymore. RIP. It's over for him.
And there is something like a tipping point. It's a social tipping point, perhaps, but when no one's willing to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes, then everyone is waiting for someone else, Todd Rose, I think, is the one that calls it collective illusions. So no one believes the thing, but everyone thinks everyone else does believe it, and no one realizes that they're actually in the like super majority consensus of common sense. And so everyone stays quiet until they don't. I feel like you've been one of the people who was out early on this woke reign of terror that is now cresting. I'll lead that into my sort of last question for this round, which is, we call this show Dad Saves America because I think that's a role we play as men that is really heroic, really important, really undervalued. And it ripples out, starting with our family, to our community, our culture, and our society as a whole. If you want to save the country, to me, and you're a man, there's few things you can do that better than become a dad and be a good one and be present and protect your kids, set them up to be adults in the future. How do you think about your role in the American story?
DARPA for the culture war still. I mean, this Rosetta Stone character, I have committed my life to serve in the capacity that I have here, which is, what are my capacities? Number one, I do have this ability to read and make some sense of what I'm reading with this material. I have a big background now against which I can compare it and make sense of it quickly. And I'm a reasonably good communicator. So I have that capacity to effectively do the Rosetta Stone thing. And the other thing that I have is apparently some kind of, mental deficiency where I can't keep my mouth shut and will take the stand, even, think somebody's like, don't take that stand, you'll get punched in the face. And I'm like, well, okay. And I take the stand anyway, and I get punched in the face. And then I get up in the morning and I stand up again. There's something wrong with me because I apparently don't learn my lesson, but that's something of a virtue. So I see myself, as whatever those things come together as. I see myself primarily as an educator. A researcher and educator is how I kind of think of myself. If you want to learn what I have to say, that's cool. I don't try to pressure anybody into it. I have no ambitions for power. I have no ambitions to be rich. I want to investigate this story and tell people what I learn. And ideally, I would like to be able to continue to do that till I die. Also, ideally, not soon. There are a lot of questions about this. How did this happen? What are the actual details? Like, there's parts of this story that I told today that are missing. My model's not complete. It would be great to be able to fill those in and to, again, just continue acting in an educational capacity. I don't think of myself as, some great leader of movements. I am funny, but I'm not terribly charismatic. I mean, it's true. I'm hilarious, but, so I don't know. I used to get compared a lot to John Revere or Paul Revere. I get compared frequently now by Christians to John the Baptist. I'm not exactly sure what that second one means, but I know who Paul Revere is. I know who John the Baptist is too, but I don't get it. I get like running around and saying the communists are coming, the communists are coming. That one's pretty easy. And I don't mind that metaphor also. That I think though the role that I've played the most in the last couple of years isn't this, educator or this, courageous watchman on the wall or the warning siren or whatever. It's actually weird. I feel like I've been going around to a dispirited people and reminding them to have faith in the country and that their actions and their activities and their commitment and their willingness to stand up all matters. I feel like I've had to give like more inspirational speeches in the last year and a half than I have any other kind. So some mix of that, I guess. But at the end of the day, I'm just a dude in East Tennessee, man. It's like, I have my little piece of land that I live on. It's not like a piece of land. That sounds like I have more than I do. I have my yard and my house, and I have my life with my family, and I'm just a guy. But I hope I can teach some people what I'm learning.
Well, I hope to have you back. I hope to have you in the studio. James Lindsay, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Yeah, thanks for having me.